Tonight, we begin at the beginning, not the kind marked by writing or war, but something older, something quieter. A moment before civilization knew what to name itself. A time when firelight danced on cave walls, and the body still spoke in symbols. This story doesn't open with kings or gods, but with a girl alone, perhaps afraid, staring down at the first red mark on her thigh. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you enjoy the kind of content that merges myth and mystery. And hey, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? What time is it for you right now? Sometimes these stories are better than sleep, and other times they just help you dream a little louder. It's time now to dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for a bit of background hum, and let's begin tonight's journey together, not in a city or a temple, but in the flickering silence of the Paleolithic night, where everything still smelled of smoke and soil, and blood was never just blood. In the earliest ages of humanity, long before parchment or ploughs, menstruation was not a secret, it was not yet a shame, it was a sign, and like all signs, it had to be interpreted. The first peoples of the world, nomads, foragers, clan-bound kin, did not leave behind written testimony, but they left clues, pigments, figurines, patterns scratched into bone. Red ochre especially appears again and again in the archaeological record, smeared across burial sites, traced onto fertility statues, painted inside deep stone caverns where no sunlight ever reached. This pigment, iron-rich and deeply crimson, was often used to mimic the colour of blood, and not just any blood, but sacred blood, life-bearing blood, menstrual blood. There is evidence that some of the earliest Venus figurines, those bulbous stylized carvings of wide-hipped women, may have functioned as talismans or visual aids for fertility. Their exaggerated bodies weren't just symbolic, they were instructional. They told a story. This is how life begins. This is where the mystery starts. Some of these figurines even appear to be painted or stained with red pigment between the legs. It was not decoration, it was meaning. For the girls of those ancient clans, the first bleed was likely terrifying. Imagine it. No explanation, no warning, just pain and colour. But over time, that fear may have turned into ritual. Anthropologists speculate that some early human groups held coming-of-age ceremonies centered around Menarche, the first period. These rites were not uniform, of course. Some may have involved isolation in red tents or menstrual huts. Others might have used chants, masks, or markings to acknowledge the shift from girlhood to womanhood. In a world where birth and death happened without warning, the cycle of menstruation was one of the few patterns that could be relied upon. It was predictable, rhythmic, lunar, and it became a kind of sacred clock. In some surviving indigenous cultures, echoes of these early practices remain. Among certain Native American tribes, for example, menstruating women were seen as powerful, so powerful in fact that they were often separated from the community, not out of shame but reverence. The Apache sunrise ceremony, though rooted in a later period, still carries echoes of this ancient perception, the idea that the onset of menstruation makes a girl into something closer to a vessel for the divine. But in prehistoric times there was no doctrine, no dogma, just experience and response. If a woman bled without injury, and then months later gave birth, that cycle had to mean something. In time, this mystery found structure. Lunar calendars, the earliest ones scratched into mammoth bone and reindeer antler, may have originated not for farming, but for tracking menstrual cycles. The phases of the moon mirrored the phases of the womb, 28 days, waxing, waning, shedding, starting again. It's not hard to imagine a woman thousands of years ago sitting under a moonlit sky and realizing that her body was in rhythm with the night sky. She may not have had the words for it, but she would have known the feeling that she and the moon were speaking the same language, just in different pulses. Archaeological digs in places like Dolní Vestonci in the Czech Republic or Blombos Cave in South Africa have revealed red ochre-stained tools and ritual objects dating back tens of thousands of years. Some appear to have been used in ceremonies. Others were buried with care, suggesting symbolic value. Was this ochre used to mark bodies, to bless wombs, or simply to recreate the look of menstrual blood in art and memory? We may never know for sure, but the consistency is striking. Across continents, red was chosen, not for battle, not for violence, but for womanhood. Even in death, menstruation may have played a role. There are prehistoric grave sites where the pelvis and thighs of female skeletons are smeared with red ochre, as if to honor the generative power of that region. These aren't battlefield honors, they're reminders. This woman bled, this woman birthed, this woman lived in rhythm, and not every mark left behind was made by tools. Anthropologists have studied menstrual seclusion as a concept even in hunter-gatherer societies. In some communities, menstruating women may have stayed apart, not as outcasts but as protectors. The blood, it was believed, held power. It could attract predators, or lightning, or spirits, and so it was given its own space. In some cultures, women gathered in menstrual huts, spaces where they could rest, sing, bond, and pass on knowledge to younger girls. These places became wombs within the tribe, a second circle of life. Others believe menstrual blood was used as medicine. In traditional African medicine, some tribes used menstrual blood in healing rituals. It was believed to carry both the essence of life and the potency of transformation. Not all these beliefs were positive, of course. Some viewed menstrual blood as dangerous or unclean, but in prehistoric times that line was blurrier. Blood was not yet a symbol of sin, it was simply part of the cycle. The idea that prehistoric menstruation was primitive or filthy is a projection, a modern invention. The reality may be the opposite. These early societies, far from misunderstanding the cycle, may have revered it. They did not hide it behind locked bathroom doors or silence it in schoolbooks. They marked it in stone, painted it on walls, embedded it in the myths they passed down by firelight. Some scholars suggest that menstruation may have even played a role in the rise of religion. If early humans perceived the moon and the womb as linked, then perhaps the goddess came before the god. Before thunder and sun and spear, there was the silent, rhythmic shedding of blood that brought no death, only life. That must have felt like magic, or something close to it. Of course, not every moment was sacred. These were harsh times. A woman bleeding in the open could become prey. Infection was common. Miscarriage was likely. And yet she endured. She bled. She healed. And the tribe continued. In modern medicine, we now understand menstruation as the shedding of the uterine lining, a biological reset, preparing the body each month for the possibility of life. But for prehistoric peoples, that explanation didn't exist. What did exist was observation, the cycle, the pattern, the power, and from that ritual, so much of what we think we know about early people is filtered through the lens of survival. Spears, hunts, fires. But beside all that, someone was marking time, scratching calendars, dabbing red onto a doll's carved thigh, whispering stories about the moon and the blood and the first woman who bled without dying. She may not have had a name, but her legacy is in the pigment we still use, in the rituals we still trace, in the way we still whisper about periods like they are something to hide. But they weren't always hidden. Once, they were the first clock, the first teacher, the first sacred rhythm of human life. And in that rhythm, in that unspoken knowledge shared by mothers and daughters around the embers of prehistoric fire, begins our history, not with kings, not with wars, but with the first red. But as humans settled, built cities and began to name their gods, that silent awe turned into story. The blood that once marked time became something else, divine, dangerous, sacred and feared. Tonight, we follow that transformation, from whispers at the cave mouth to the thrones of Olympus, the temples of India, and the scrolls of Mesopotamia. We ask what it meant when menstruation entered mythology. So before you settle in completely, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you enjoy drifting into the soft overlap of ancient history and timeless wonder. And tell us, what hour is it where you are right now? Are you listening in the dark with the moon above you, or is it morning and you're walking through this quietly with earbuds in? Wherever you are, you're not alone, not tonight. Now dim the lights, let the fan hum if it helps, and step with me into a world where blood was not hidden but mythologized, where gods bled and so did the cosmos. There's an old belief, older than Rome, older than even Babylon, that menstrual blood wasn't just a bodily function, it was power in its rawest form. In some ancient cultures it was life-giving, a creative force more potent than any weapon. In others, it was feared, controlled, pushed to the edge of purity laws and temple thresholds. But across continents, one thing remained consistent. This blood had meaning. It was never neutral. In ancient Egypt, the goddess Isis was the ruler of life and magic, a healer, a mother, a queen. Some scholars suggest that her sacred knot, the Tayet symbol, shaped like a sash or ankh with drooping arms, may have symbolized a menstrual cloth imbued with her divine essence. Her blood, mythically, was not waste, it was curative. Protective amulets, shaped like the knot of Isis, were often dyed red and buried with the dead to ensure safety in the afterlife. Blood, after all, didn't just signify life, it was also a seal against death. The Egyptians weren't alone. In Mesopotamian lore, menstruation made its way into origin stories. One ancient Sumerian myth speaks of how the gods created humanity from clay, but it was the blood of a slain goddess that brought the clay to life. Some versions suggest the goddess Tiamat, chaos incarnate, was split open, her blood mingling with dust to form mankind. In this version, woman's blood was literally the ingredient of life, not a curse, not a sin, a source. Even the male gods couldn't escape the symbolism. The Mesopotamian god Enki, who ruled over water and creation, once attempted to consume the sacred knowledge of the goddess Ninhursag, and in doing so absorbed her powers, including the cycle of menstruation. He became ill, and she had to create new deities from his pain to heal him. In myth, the male body couldn't contain that cycle, it wasn't built for it. But perhaps no civilization mythologized menstruation more deeply, or more ambiguously than India. The Vedic and later Puranic traditions are layered, contradictory, and rich with symbolism. In one myth, the gods commit the first cosmic sin, the killing of a Brahmin. The burden of that sin, it's said, was divided among the earth, the waters, the trees, and women. Their share of the burden, the monthly cycle of blood. But even as menstruation was framed as punishment, it was never without power. In tantric traditions, the red bindu, or point, represents the seat of feminine energy, Shakti. Some tantric texts revere menstrual blood, known as Rajaswala, as spiritually potent. It was used in certain rituals to enhance fertility, invoke deities, and amplify magical practices. The very things seen as taboo in one temple could be treated as sacred offering in another. There's even a temple, Kamakya, in Assam, where the goddess is not depicted in human form at all. Instead, her womb and yoni, the generative organ, are worshipped directly. Every year during the festival of Ambubachi Mela, it's believed that the goddess menstruates. The temple closes for 3 days. The waters of the nearby Brahmaputra turn slightly red, and devotees wait in reverence. When it reopens, cloths soaked in the water believed to be tinged with her divine menstrual essence are distributed as blessings. Here, bleeding is divinity, not defilement. Across the sea, in ancient Greece, blood was often a boundary between gods and mortals, between purity and pollution. The goddess Artemis, protector of young girls and childbirth, was paradoxically also a virgin. Her temples were sometimes sites for offerings tied to puberty and the cycles of life, yet her purity stood in tension with the messiness of bleeding and birthing. Greek philosophy was not kind to menstruation. Hippocrates and later Aristotle framed it as a pathological purge, a necessary but inferior function, a sign of imbalance, and yet myths tell a different story. The Erinyes, or Furies, goddesses of vengeance, were born of blood, specifically blood shed unjustly. In some versions, they were born from the blood of Uranus, cut by his son Kronos. Blood created divine beings. Blood had teeth. The Greeks also told of Iphigenia, a virgin girl sacrificed by her father Agamemnon to calm the winds. Some feminist scholars have read her story through a menstrual lens, a young woman on the cusp of womanhood offered up in blood to appease a patriarchal world. Her sacrifice was not metaphor, it was a trade. Maidenhood for wind, blood for war. In Mesoamerican mythology, menstrual blood appears again, this time among the Aztecs. In some traditions, it's said that the moon goddess Cayoxahuac, dismembered by her brother Huitzilopochtli, bled across the sky, and from her dismembered body came the stars. Blood, again, as creation. Her scattered limbs shimmered nightly, her blood echoing across the cosmos in silver light. Among the Maya, women's blood, especially menstrual blood, was seen as capable of giving birth to gods. Some elite women even performed bloodletting rituals using obsidian blades, sometimes drawing blood from the genitals as offerings. It was not shameful, it was sacred. Even in regions where written myths don't survive, archaeology whispers the same story. In early African tribal cosmologies, menstrual blood was often linked to rain, fertility, the earth's cycles. In Aboriginal Australian Dreamtime tales, women's blood was used to paint sacred objects, trace maps, and mark ceremonies. One tale speaks of a woman whose bleeding formed the first red rivers, shaping the land as she walked. But this reverence was always fragile. As patriarchal structures deepened and priesthoods became male-dominated, the power of menstrual blood was increasingly recast as pollution. The same blood once used to form humanity was now seen as contaminating temples, defiling altars, and requiring atonement. The sacred became dangerous. The myth became moral law, and still, contradictions remained. In ancient Japan, Shinto beliefs viewed menstruation as a form of kagare impurity, but one that could be cleansed. Yet Shinto shrine maidens, miko, who were often young and unmarried, performed dances and rituals believed to bridge the mortal and the divine. Their purity was not the absence of blood, but the cycle of it. The line between sacred and impure was not fixed, it pulsed. Over time, the world's myths grew more distant from the body. Philosophy replaced story, theology replaced symbol, but beneath those layers of abstraction, the old belief still flickered. Blood, especially menstrual blood, remained too powerful to ignore. It had created gods. It had shaped rivers. It had drawn the moon into rhythm. It could not be forgotten, only reframed. And so temples that once closed for a goddess's period now closed their doors to bleeding women. Rituals that once used menstrual cloths now forbade them. The divine became taboo. Reverence became silence. But the stories remain. If you look closely, if you sift through the dust of ruins and the pages of forgotten texts, you'll find them, traces of a world where the first blood was not just biology, it was origin, sacrifice, power, God-touched. We don't bleed myths anymore, but we still carry them in shame, in silence, in the small rituals we don't question, the tampon behind the sleeve, the whisper in the bathroom, the embarrassment, the instinct to hide. And perhaps if we remember the blood of the gods, we can begin to unlearn that hiding. The sacred red of the goddess slowly turned into a mark of exile. A cycle once aligned with the moon, and life was redefined as punishment. Tonight, we move from story to scripture, from reverence to regulation. This is the chapter where blood becomes a curse. So before you sink too deep into your pillow or drift off entirely, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you find beauty in the forgotten, meaning in the margins. And as always, let us know what time is it where you are right now. Are you just winding down or already halfway to sleep? Now dim the lights, let the quiet hum around you settle, and join me as we follow the stain of shame through the sacred texts of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, where menstruation was not erased but reshaped. This is where the blood begins to hurt. In the beginning there was a garden, a woman, a man, and a decision. The book of Genesis frames it as a fall, a moment when Eve, tempted by knowledge, bites into something forbidden and brings mortality to the world. But what came with that fall wasn't just exile, it was pain, suffering, bleeding. Genesis 3:16 delivers the decree, "I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children." It doesn't mention menstruation directly, but it doesn't need to. Embedded in that sentence is the beginning of a pattern that the female body, its cycles and sufferings, is the price of disobedience. Blood becomes debt, and that debt is itemized in Leviticus, the third book of the Hebrew Bible, a text less poetic than Genesis, but far more prescriptive. Chapter 15 lays it out with clinical precision. When a woman has her regular flow of blood, the impurity of her monthly period will last 7 days, and anyone who touches her will be unclean until evening. Leviticus 15:19. If the bleeding lasts longer than usual, the days of impurity extend with it. When it finally ends, the woman must count 7 clean days, then bring 2 turtle doves or pigeons to the priest as a sin offering. Think about that. 2 birds, not for something done, but for something her body did. A sin offering, not symbolic, but systemic. In Judaism, this passage becomes the foundation for Niddah, the laws surrounding menstrual purity. Orthodox Jewish women following Niddah refrain from physical contact with their husbands during menstruation, and for 7 days after. Only after ritual immersion in a mikveh, a bath of living water, can physical closeness resume. To the modern eye, this can feel archaic, even cruel, but it's more complicated than that. Some women describe the mikveh as a sacred, empowering moment, a full-body return. Others see it as burden, but all of it stems from Leviticus, from a belief that menstruation is not neutral, it requires correction, atonement. The Talmud, a vast collection of rabbinical interpretations, goes further. In some passages, menstruation is described as a form of death, a monthly loss of potential life. Others treat it like fire, powerful but dangerous. Uncontrolled, it contaminates. Controlled, it preserves sanctity. And yet, despite all these restrictions, the same texts also speak of menstrual blood with a kind of holy fear. The Shekinah, the feminine aspect of the divine presence, was sometimes said to dwell with women during their periods. Unapproachable, yes, but not abandoned. This contradiction between impurity and sacredness echoes into Christianity, which inherited many Jewish laws but reinterpreted them through the lens of Christ and the early church fathers. In the New Testament, menstruation is almost invisible. Jesus never explicitly addresses it, but one woman's story breaks through the silence. In the Gospel of Mark, chapter 5, we meet a woman who has been bleeding for 12 years. The text calls her unclean. Doctors could not help her. She is unnamed, untouchable, and alone, but she hears of Jesus, and in secret she reaches out, touches the hem of his garment. Instantly the bleeding stops. Jesus turns and asks, "Who touched me?" The woman trembles, afraid, but he says, "Daughter, your faith has healed you." It's a profound moment, a reversal. Not only is she not punished, she is blessed. Her act of faith, her body's impurity, becomes a pathway to healing. Some theologians read this as a symbolic redemption of all women's suffering. Others see it as a quiet protest against Levitical codes. But either way, it stands alone, the exception, not the rule. Because by the 2nd century, the early church began to treat menstruation with suspicion. Tertullian, one of Christianity's first theologians, described women as the devil's gateway, blaming Eve for all sin and death. Menstruation for him was a visible sign of that inherited fault. Augustine, the Bishop of Hippo, didn't dwell on menstruation directly, but helped embed the belief in bodily impurity and sexual guilt that would define Christian attitudes for centuries. And by the medieval period, the rules were clear. Menstruating women were barred from receiving communion, forbidden to touch sacred objects, and often excluded from church services entirely. Some texts warned that menstrual blood could tarnish the Eucharist. Others claimed it could spoil crops, dull swords, or even summon demons. The Decretum Gratiani, a foundational canon law text from the 12th century, compiled earlier prohibitions and made them standard. It wasn't just custom, it was law, and yet the fear remained oddly obsessed. Medieval theologians debated the nature of menstrual blood. Was it a failed child, a corrupted seed, a sign of weakness, or a divine warning? Some claimed that Mary, the mother of Christ, never menstruated at all. Her body, untouched by sin, was also untouched by blood. This became a theological assertion. To be holy was to be beyond the cycle. To bleed was to fall. Meanwhile, women who did bleed were often left to navigate a spiritual life filled with contradiction. Cloistered nuns may have hidden their cycles. Pilgrims bled on long roads to Rome, wrapping rags in silence. No one spoke of it, but everyone knew. And still the pain of exclusion echoed. In Islam, the Quran addresses menstruation more directly. Surah Al-Baqarah 222 states, "I can asbat the moderayan the bekemi lobberly kadam sadwa." To Cauldron Hubbling Mork states the lobel juridic indeed was payam. Say, it is harm, so keep away from women during menstruation and do not approach them until they are pure. This verse forms the foundation for Islamic laws surrounding Haid, the menstrual period. During Haid, women are excused from fasting, prayer, and sexual relations. They are not forbidden from mosques by the Quran itself, but in some cultures they are discouraged from entering. Like in Judaism, ritual purity tahara is central. After menstruation ends, women perform ghusl, a full-body purification. Only then can they resume religious duties. The hadiths, sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, offer some nuance. In one narration, the Prophet prays with his head in the lap of Aisha, his wife, while she is menstruating. In another, he tells a woman not to be ashamed of her cycle. This is something Allah has ordained for the daughters of Adam, he says. But over time, interpretation varied. Some jurists extended restrictions. Others emphasized mercy. As with all religions, scripture and culture began to pull in different directions. And so we are left with a legacy, both heavy and invisible. Laws carved into scripture, silences passed down in ritual, a theology of absence. Menstrual blood, the same blood once used to form man from clay, once believed to house divinity, became unworthy of the altar. It was quarantined, named, managed, and for centuries women bled in silence, in convents, in camps, in cities of stone and villages of dust. They folded cloth, avoided touch, and whispered apologies to gods they were told they had offended by simply being themselves. And yet the cycle continued, the blood returned, month after month, generation after generation, not cursed, not evil, just misunderstood. Next time we'll lift our eyes to the heavens and trace how the moon and menstruation remain tethered across time. We'll explore lunar calendars, celestial myths, and the strange enduring idea that the womb and the sky were always in rhythm. But for now, rest knowing this. Even in exile, the blood flowed. Even in silence, it spoke. But even as religious texts tried to define what blood meant, another story kept whispering underneath, a quieter, older rhythm, the kind you don't read, you feel. Tonight, we follow that rhythm up into the night sky, into the phases of the moon, into the body's secret clock. This is the story of the celestial womb. But before we begin, if you find value in these hidden histories, if you like falling asleep to soft voices that travel through myth and time, then feel free to like the video and subscribe. No pressure, just a gentle nudge. And tell us, where are you tuning in from tonight? What's the sky like outside your window? Sometimes all it takes is one shared silence to remind us that we're part of something bigger. Now get cozy, let the world quiet down, and let's look up toward the lunar arc that shaped not only tides and calendars, but human bodies and beliefs for thousands of years. The moon has always been more than just a rock in the sky. For early humans, it was a guide. a nightlight in a dark world, a shapeshifter. Its reliable pattern, the waxing, the waning, the full and the gone, offered something rare in a time before clocks, a sense of order. It told hunters when animals might migrate. It told planters when to sow seeds. And more quietly, it told women something about themselves. Roughly 29.5 days. That's how long it takes the moon to complete its cycle. And it's also, on average, how long it takes the menstrual cycle to complete. This overlap isn't perfect. Every body is different. But it's close enough to have sparked millennia of meaning. For many ancient cultures, it wasn't just coincidence. It was connection. In some indigenous communities, the moon was called Grandmother Moon, guardian of water and life. She was the keeper of women's time. Some North American tribes referred to menstruation as moon time, and women would retreat together during this phase, not out of shame, but to rest, reflect, and dream. The idea was simple but profound. Menstruation wasn't separate from nature, it was part of it. It was the body's way of listening to the sky. In Polynesian tradition, the moon goddess Hina was associated with both the tides and the menstrual cycle. The connection between blood and water, both essential, both cleansing, ran deep. In some myths, when Hina bled, the ocean turned red. In others, her cycle marked the rhythm of the islands themselves. In ancient Chinese cosmology, yin and yang explained the universe in opposites, dark and light, passive and active, moon and sun. Yin was the moon, feminine, fluid, cool. The womb and its rhythms were expressions of yin energy, sacred, balanced, and necessary. The moon didn't just reflect light, it reflected the inner world of the body. The same idea surfaced in early Hindu astronomy. Ancient Indian scholars like Varahamihira noted the relationship between the moon's position and female fertility. Astrology, medicine, and ritual intertwined. Some even believed that conception was most likely when a woman's cycle aligned with certain lunar phases. And in Babylon, the lunar deity Sign, or Nana, was worshipped in ziggurats that rose toward the heavens like staircases for the soul. Priests and priestesses tracked his phases meticulously, not just to mark months, but to understand the flow of time itself. There's evidence suggesting that lunar observations were used to monitor not only agricultural cycles but reproductive ones as well. But it wasn't always scientific. Sometimes it was just human. You bleed with the moon. You watch her vanish. Then you wait for her to return, like your own body does. That's not data, that's intuition. In many African cosmologies, this cycle was more than metaphor. Among the Dagara people of Burkina Faso, the menstrual cycle was considered a sign of a woman's alignment with the cosmic order. Elders described it not as biology, but as spiritual synchronization. The blood marked her readiness to receive visions, connect with ancestors, and participate in sacred storytelling. Even in Europe, long before institutional religion drew its dividing lines, the moon was woven into folk beliefs about the body. Old English midwives, Celtic healers, Italian stragus, they all paid attention to lunar phases when prescribing herbs, predicting fertility, or aiding births. Red clover, mugwort and raspberry leaf, many plants associated with womb health, were harvested under full moons, as if lunar light infused them with extra potency. And let's not forget the tides. The gravitational pull of the moon affects the oceans. Twice a day, waves rise and fall in response. Human bodies, composed mostly of water, were thought to respond the same way. This belief, though not medically accurate in a strict sense, feels symbolically true. The idea that we ebb and flow with celestial forces has never really left us. In the Islamic world, the lunar calendar governs religious life. Ramadan, Eid, and other observances shift according to the moon. And although Islamic teachings around menstruation involve ritual boundaries, the moon's cycle remains the master clock. In some Sufi poetry, the female body is likened to the moon itself, bright, hidden, cyclical, and powerful. There's even a theory, widely debated but deeply poetic, that the earliest calendars were made not for crops or conquests, But for tracking menstruation, the Blombos Cave ochre stones in South Africa, dating back over 70,000 years, show hash mark patterns that some scholars believe are early lunar counts. The Ishango bone from Central Africa, over 20,000 years old, has notches grouped in ways that mirror lunar phases. Were these the first menstrual trackers? We may never know. But what matters is that someone somewhere was watching the moon, and maybe, just maybe, watching her own body at the same time. As we move deeper into organized religion, the moon's feminine associations began to dim. The sun, fiery, masculine, dominant, took center stage. The lunar cycle, once tied to fertility and mystery, became associated with unreliability, inconsistency, madness. The word lunacy, derived from lunar, blamed the moon for everything from hysteria to seizures. Slowly, the body that bled in rhythm with the moon was seen as too wild to trust, and yet we never stopped watching her. Even today, apps that track cycles often use moon symbols. Wellness trends promote syncing your diet, exercise and self-care with lunar phases. Cycle syncing, though not universally backed by science, is wildly popular. It speaks to a deep cultural desire to return to rhythm, to stop seeing menstruation as something to suppress and start seeing it as something to understand. In a world of digital clocks and artificial lights, the moon remains a soft rebellion, a reminder that time can be felt, not just counted. And here's something else. While not everyone who menstruates experiences a 28-day cycle, and not everyone with a womb menstruates, the metaphor remains: the moon and the body both change, both vanish and return, both reflect light in different ways, both are full, and then empty, and then full again. And when we speak of celestial wombs, we don't only mean the ones inside bodies, we mean the tombs carved to mirror the moon, the stone circles aligned with solstices, the temples where priestesses bled under moonlight and whispered prayers to rhythms they couldn't explain but still trusted. We mean the night sky itself, pregnant with meaning, forever cycling, never ashamed of her phases. This chapter, this part of the story matters because it reminds us that menstruation was never meant to be linear, it was never meant to be hidden in shame or managed in silence. It was always part of something larger: the sky, the tide, the turning of months. In modern times, we've learnt to measure hormones and predict ovulation with precision, but precision isn't meaning. Meaning comes from connection, and the moon in her quiet orbit has always offered that. So next time you look up, remember, someone long ago did the same. Maybe she had just started her first cycle. Maybe she was bleeding for the last time. Maybe she was simply tracking the sky to understand herself. She didn't call it data, she called it time. But as cultures grew more complex and curious, they didn't stop at symbolism. They began to ask, what is this blood? Where does it come from? What does it do to the body and the mind? And most importantly, how do we treat it? Tonight, we enter the realm of ancient medicine, a world of humours, herbs, heated debates, and whispered diagnoses. A time when healers and physicians tried to explain menstruation not with gods, but with theories, some thoughtful, some misguided, all revealing. If you haven't yet, feel free to like and subscribe, but only if you enjoy drifting through history's quieter corridors. And let us know where you are tonight. Are you resting, travelling, or somewhere in between? Now dim the lights, find your breath, and step softly into a world where blood was both symptom and cure, where the womb held not just life, but mystery. In ancient Greece, medicine and philosophy often held hands. Theories of the body were not separate from theories of the cosmos, and central to both was the concept of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. According to Hippocrates, considered the father of Western medicine, health was a matter of balance between these fluids. Illness occurred when one dominated, and for women, menstruation was believed to be a kind of natural purging, a way to expel excess blood and prevent illness. It wasn't seen as abnormal, it was necessary. This view carried a strange kind of logic. Men, after all, didn't bleed monthly, so how did they stay in balance? They were expected to sweat, engage in physical labor, and release fluids through other means. But women's bodies, considered inherently more moist and cold in humoral terms, needed menstruation to stay healthy. If the blood didn't come out, something was wrong. Galen, a Roman physician who built on Hippocrates' ideas, argued that menstrual blood was not just a waste product, it was unfinished nourishment. In his view, blood was meant to feed a growing fetus. When no pregnancy occurred, the excess was shed. He even suggested that menstrual blood could be used by the body to grow tumours or swellings if it wasn't properly released. This led to treatments focused on restoring the flow. And here we meet one of the most enduring beliefs in ancient medicine. Retention of menstrual blood was dangerous. This fear of retention led to all kinds of diagnostic practices. If a woman experienced pain, dizziness, melancholy, or seizures, physicians might assume that her blood was trapped. The treatment? Induced bleeding. This could be done through herbs, heat, massage, or in some cases, more invasive methods. The idea was simple, if flawed. Get the blood moving, and health will return. Of course, menstruation wasn't just a concern for when it went missing. Even when it occurred regularly, it was thought to affect the entire body. Ancient medical texts describe how women were more emotional, more porous, more influenced by their environment during their cycle. Some believed the womb could wander through the body, causing hysteria, choking, or paralysis. The womb in these theories was a living creature, hungry, moody, capable of travel. This condition, called hysteria, became a medical catch-all for female ailments. And while it was based on anatomical misunderstanding, it influenced centuries of treatment. Baths, fumigations, and herbal infusions were used to calm the womb and keep it in place. But not all remedies were rooted in error. Ancient physicians did observe patterns and responses. They knew that certain herbs eased cramping, that warm compresses soothed abdominal pain, that rest was helpful. The problem was the frame. Rather than understanding menstruation as a natural variation, it was seen as an unstable force, one that needed regulation. And yet medicine wasn't always male-dominated. Throughout antiquity, midwives and female healers carried their own traditions, often rooted in experience rather than theory. In Egypt, papyri from over 3,000 years ago record treatments for what modern readers might recognize as PMS symptoms, irregular bleeding or fertility challenges. Honey, dates, and oil mixtures were applied vaginally. Aromatics like myrrh or frankincense were used to cleanse or stimulate the womb. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest medical texts in existence, lists dozens of treatments related to menstruation. Some are practical, others ritualistic. One prescription suggests crocodile dung as a suppository, perhaps symbolic, perhaps magical. Either way, it reflects how sacred and strange the womb was considered. In India, Ayurvedic texts from as early as 600 BCE offer a different lens. Menstruation was classified according to doshas, vata, pitta, and kapha, energetic forces that governed health. An imbalance in vata, for example, could cause painful or irregular periods. Treatments included warm oils, gentle massage, dietary changes, and time in nature. While some prescriptions mirrored the humoral model, Ayurveda leaned more toward harmony than punishment. Still, it wasn't immune to bias. Women were sometimes advised to avoid certain foods, public spaces, or even sleep positions during menstruation, not just for physical reasons but for spiritual purity. In China, traditional Chinese medicine TCM viewed menstruation as a vital part of qi flow, the body's life force. Blood, or shui, and qi were closely linked. Menstrual irregularities were treated with acupuncture, moxibustion, burning herbs near the skin, and complex herbal formulas. Dongquai, often called female ginseng, was used to tonify blood and regulate cycles. Unlike some Western theories, TCM did not see menstruation as dirty, but it still treated it as delicate. A disruption in cycle was seen as a sign of systemic imbalance, physical, emotional, or environmental. Across cultures, menstrual medicine existed in a liminal space, part science, part spirituality. Some treatments worked because they were effective. Others worked because belief itself has power, and belief was always in full supply. Even in the Islamic Golden Age, where science flourished, menstrual medicine continued to evolve. Scholars like Avicenna and Al-Razi wrote medical encyclopedias that included entire sections on the menstrual cycle. They discussed causes for amenorrhea, absence of bleeding, dysmenorrhea, painful bleeding, and methods to ease symptoms. Honey, saffron, and vinegar were common remedies. Baths infused with roses and lavender were prescribed for calming both body and mind. It's important to note that while these texts were written by men, many healing practices were performed by women. Mothers, midwives, neighbours. Their knowledge passed orally, from hand to hand, cloth to cloth. They didn't write textbooks, they wrote memory. And in that memory lived the unspoken rules: how to fold the cloth, what root to boil, when to speak, and when to simply listen. Not all ancient treatments were gentle. Some were alarming. Fumigation with burning substances, bloodletting from the ankle to balance the womb, herbal concoctions that could cause severe reactions. These were desperate solutions for misunderstood conditions, but they remind us how central the menstrual body was to medicine. It wasn't peripheral, it was the focus, even if misunderstood, and that misunderstanding lasted. By the Middle Ages in Europe, Greco-Roman humoral theory still dominated, but now it was fused with Christian morality. Menstrual blood, once treated as natural imbalance, became moral stain. Treatments shifted from restoring flow to cleansing the soul. Medical texts spoke of sin and impurity as causes for irregular bleeding. The body became a battleground between physiology and faith. But despite all this, the remedies continued. Herbs like chamomile, cramp bark, black cohosh, and valerian were used to ease pain. Poultices and teas were passed down like treasure, and women, through trial and error, kept track of what helped. Calendars were carved, notched, or whispered. She bleeds on the full moon. She aches near the dark moon. The moon and the medicine stayed intertwined. Even now, echoes remain. Modern medicine offers a clearer picture. Hormones, ovulation, endometrial lining, prostaglandins. But it's built on a long road of observation, myth, and trial. Some of it harmful, some of it wise, all of it human. And if we look closely, we can still find the hands that healed, the cloth folded in a drawer, the steam rising from a bowl, the whispered knowledge in kitchens and caves, none of it written in stone, but remembered in blood, not cursed, not broken, just misread. Tonight, we trace the twin threads of taboo and tolerance. We visit ancient India and China, not to flatten their histories into one idea, but to listen carefully to how each culture responded to the same bodily truth, in different tongues and tones. If you find calm in these quiet histories, if you enjoy drifting through the unspoken parts of the past, feel free to like and subscribe, and let us know where you're watching from tonight. What's outside your window? A city? A tree? A full moon? Now settle in. Let your breath slow, and let's walk together through temples and tea houses, manuscripts and moon gates, to see how two great cultures understood the blood that returned each month like a second heartbeat. In ancient India, menstruation was framed through a deeply spiritual lens. The Vedas, some of the oldest sacred texts in human history, contain scattered but significant references to the menstrual cycle. One of the earliest appears in the Rig Veda, where menstruation is associated with the sin of a primordial figure, Indra, king of the gods. According to one myth, Indra committed a cosmic offense, the killing of a Brahmin, a sacred priest. His guilt, too immense for one being, was divided among various elements of the world. Women, the myth tells us, received a portion of this sin, and this portion manifested as menstruation, not always loudly, but persistently. It gave menstruation a spiritual origin, but one entangled with blame, and yet the culture that produced this myth also produced a deeply complex system of bodily philosophy. In Ayurveda, the ancient Indian science of life, menstruation was not punishment, it was purification, the body's natural way of maintaining balance. Menstrual blood, Raja, was described as part of a cycle that, when functioning smoothly, ensured fertility, health, and spiritual well-being. Women were advised to rest during their cycles, not because they were unclean, but because menstruation marked a period of heightened sensitivity. Some Ayurvedic texts recommend warm baths, nourishing foods, and quiet reflection. There was care in the advice, gentleness. But alongside this tolerance, taboos formed. In Dharmashastra literature, ancient legal and ethical codes, rules around menstruation became more rigid. Women were advised to avoid cooking, sleeping in the same bed as others, or participating in religious rituals while menstruating. These restrictions were framed as spiritual hygiene, not punishment, but protection. The idea was that menstrual energy, potent and liminal, might disrupt ritual purity. The Manusmriti, one of the most cited Hindu legal texts, codified many of these ideas. It described menstruating women as temporarily impure, requiring seclusion and abstention from temple visits or household duties. It's important to note that these texts were written by male scholars and often reflected an elite Brahminical worldview, not necessarily the lived reality of all Indian women. In practice, customs varied by region, caste, and family. In some homes, menstruating women rested in separate quarters and were brought food and water with care. In others, the separation carried shame. Still, across much of ancient India, the cycle was acknowledged, not erased. The blood may have been regulated, but it was not forgotten. There were even goddesses who bled. In the eastern regions of India, especially in Assam, the goddess Kamakya was worshipped as a menstruating deity. Her temple, built atop a hill shaped like a womb, holds a sacred spring believed to turn red once a year during the Ambubachi Mela, a festival celebrating the goddess's menstrual period. During this time, the temple closes for 3 days, not out of shame, but reverence. Devotees gather by the thousands to honor her rest, to recognize that even the divine must pause, bleed, renew. This coexistence of reverence and restriction is key to understanding ancient India's view of menstruation. It was powerful, and power, in any form, demands caution. Now let's turn our gaze eastward to ancient China, where the menstrual cycle was folded into a medical and metaphysical system that saw the body as a reflection of the cosmos. In traditional Chinese medicine, TCM, the concept of shui, blood, was central to health, and menstrual blood was not seen as waste, but as life force. It was one of the purest expressions of a woman's inner state. When a woman's cycle was regular, it indicated balance. When it faltered, it suggested an internal disharmony between yin and yang, between the body and the universe. Unlike in some other cultures, Chinese medicine did not treat menstruation as inherently impure. Instead, it treated it as delicate, sacred in its own quiet way. The womb Baogong was considered the palace of the child. Its functioning was governed by the Chong and Ren meridians, energetic pathways that influenced both physical and emotional health. When menstrual blood flowed too little or too much, the diagnosis often pointed not to sin, but to imbalance. The liver, the spleen, the emotions, the climate. Treatments were holistic. Herbs like dong quai, peony root, and cinnamon bark were prescribed to regulate flow, ease pain, and nourish the blood. Acupuncture points along the abdomen and legs were stimulated to encourage harmony. There was no punishment, only recalibration. But even here, taboos took root. Confucian ethics emphasized hierarchy, order, and social discipline. Within this framework, menstruating women were often expected to remove themselves from certain rituals, not because they were dirty, but because their condition represented flux, and flux disrupted the ideal of stillness. In some classical texts, menstruating women were discouraged from participating in ancestor worship or entering sacred spaces. Temples and ancestral halls were domains of precision and permanence. Menstrual blood, changing, moving, emotional, was seen as destabilizing to that order. But again, practice varied. In many rural communities, these rules were loosely interpreted. Women navigated their cycles quietly, supported by midwives, mothers, and herbalists who passed down practical knowledge in kitchens and gardens, not courtrooms. It's worth noting that while menstruation was largely absent from imperial records, it was present in the daily life of the people. Bamboo texts and silk manuscripts mention menstruation in the context of pregnancy, fertility, and dreams. One text from the Han Dynasty mentions how certain dreams during menstruation might predict the sex of a future child. In Taoist alchemy, menstrual blood was sometimes believed to possess transformative power. In certain esoteric traditions, it was even collected and used in rituals meant to extend life or enhance spiritual energy. This was not widespread belief, but it existed in quiet, mystical corners. So once again we find contradiction. Menstruation as imbalance and also as energy, as limitation and also as power. Women as vulnerable and also as vessels of cosmic renewal. Together, ancient India and China show us that tolerance and taboo often lived side by side. In both cultures, menstruation was treated with caution, but not always with disdain. The blood was acknowledged, tracked, treated in temples, in medicine, in myth. The rules weren't always kind, but they were built from a worldview where everything had its time, its place, its season. Menstruation, in these contexts, was not just biology, it was a signal, a clock, a moment of pause in a world obsessed with motion. And so the cycle continued, silently, faithfully, across generations of women who bled without needing to be told why. They may not have had the words, but they had the rhythm, and sometimes that was enough. In the shadowed courtyards of medieval cities, under domes etched with stars, and inside candlelit chapels, one topic passed quietly from generation to generation, spoken not in sermons or scrolls, but in glances, gestures, and quiet instruction. Menstruation in the Islamic world and Christian medieval Europe was not merely a bodily function, it was a moral condition, a legal matter, a sacred rhythm wrapped in rules, often uttered not with cruelty, but with caution. Tonight, we enter that hush. We'll walk beside scholars and saints, into schools of law and prayer rooms. We'll listen closely to how two powerful worldviews tried to shape something they couldn't see, and sometimes barely dared to speak aloud. But before we begin, if you find these histories valuable, histories carried more by silence than sound, feel free to like the video and subscribe, and let us know where you are in the world. Who taught you what you know about the body? Was it a book, a parent, a friend, or was it something you had to figure out on your own? Now breathe gently, and let's open a door that for centuries remained mostly closed. In the early Islamic world, menstruation was addressed with more clarity than many might expect. The Quran, unlike many earlier religious texts, refers directly to menstruation in several verses. The most frequently cited is Surah Al-Baqarah 2:22. Say, it is harm or discomfort, so keep away from women during menstruation and do not approach them until they are pure. This verse became the cornerstone of Islamic jurisprudence on the subject. It established that menstruation was a state of ritual impurity, not of moral impurity. The distinction was critical. In Islam, ritual impurity does not imply sinfulness. It merely designates a temporary state in which a person cannot perform specific acts of worship, such as prayer or fasting. Menstruating women were excused, not barred, from these acts. It was a period of rest, not rejection. However, interpretation varied across madhahib, the four main schools of Islamic law. The Hanafi and Maliki schools allowed women to recite the Quran silently or from memory while menstruating, particularly if they were students or teachers. The Shafi and Hanbali schools were more restrictive, discouraging any direct contact with the sacred text during the menstrual period. Despite these legal nuances, menstruation was largely treated with practicality in early Islamic society. It was neither celebrated nor demonized. It was simply acknowledged and managed. In daily life, customs were shaped not just by law, but by cultural variation. In some regions, women quietly withdrew from communal prayer. In others, they continued attending gatherings, sitting slightly apart, or performing dhikr, remembrance of God in softer ways. Women often learned these customs not from male scholars, but from older women in the family. It was an oral tradition layered beneath the written one. One striking example of this approach lies in the life of Aisha, wife of the Prophet Muhammad. Numerous hadith narrations of the Prophet's sayings include references to Aisha's menstrual state. In one, she recalls the Prophet resting his head in her lap while she was menstruating. In another, she is instructed on how to cleanse blood from clothing. These hadiths don't dramatize or condemn menstruation. They normalize it. They bring it out of abstraction and into the human realm. Still, the public language around menstruation remained restrained. Mosques and madrasas prioritized modesty in all things, and menstruation, though acknowledged, was rarely dissected in sermons or written treatises outside legal contexts. Where the silence deepened, however, was in the cultural afterlives of these laws. As Islam spread across continents from Arabia to Persia, from North Africa to the Malay world, local customs intertwined with doctrine. In some places, these customs grew more restrictive. Women were encouraged to isolate themselves entirely during menstruation. In others, the silence became protection, a way to avoid shame in patriarchal systems, where discussion of the body could be dangerous. And yet, within these constraints, knowledge was preserved. Midwives and herbalists developed treatments for irregular cycles, pain, and fatigue. Women brewed infusions of mint, anise, or saffron. They used clove oil for cramping. They passed down advice on rest, breath, posture. They didn't need books, they had memory. In wealthier Islamic cities, women sometimes owned medical texts. Manuscripts from 10th century Baghdad and 12th century Cordoba include chapters on gynecology. Doctors like Avicenna discussed menstrual health in clinical terms, treating it as part of the natural physiology of women, not a divine curse. But again, these works were usually read by men. The women who lived the experience often had no need for theory. They trusted patterns, herbs, warmth, and privacy. Meanwhile, in Christian medieval Europe, a different kind of silence was growing. Here, menstruation was not simply a state of ritual impurity, it was linked directly to original sin. The roots of this idea stretch back to the book of Genesis. After Eve eats the forbidden fruit, pain and labor enter the world. While menstruation is not named explicitly, it became folded into this story, understood by later theologians as part of the punishment for woman's disobedience. By the time of the early church fathers, this association hardened. Tornelin, Ambrose, and others wrote of the female body as a site of temptation and weakness. Menstruation, in their view, was not just a symptom of mortality, it was a monthly reminder of the fall, and so restrictions followed. Medieval church law varied by region, but across much of Europe, menstruating women were discouraged, or even banned from receiving communion, touching holy objects or entering certain parts of churches. Some were instructed not to make confession during their period. Others were told not to bake communion bread or handle sacred linens. Unlike in Islamic law, which offered structured allowances, Christian doctrine left much to local custom, and custom was rarely kind. In rural villages, menstruating women were sometimes viewed with suspicion. If crops failed or livestock fell ill, whispers might circulate. Was there a woman bleeding nearby? Had she touched something sacred? This suspicion bled into broader views of women's bodies. Medieval medical texts, heavily influenced by Galenic and Aristotelian theory, described women as colder, wetter, more corruptible than men. Menstrual blood was often described as toxic, the body's way of purging excess and corruption. Some believed its fumes could wilt flowers, dull mirrors, or cause disease. Yet even here there were complexities. Women in medieval monasteries often kept detailed records of their cycles, not out of shame but to coordinate fasting, prayer, or penance. Some anchorites, women who chose to live in spiritual isolation, wrote openly about their bleeding in journals, treating it as part of their bodily devotion. And in the secular world, wise women and midwives continued to tend to menstrual health with quiet confidence. They crafted remedies from yarrow, mugwort, and raspberry leaf. They taught girls when to expect their first cycle, how to care for cloths when to rest. Their knowledge, though largely unwritten, endured. Silence was the vessel, and in that silence, care was passed. What ties these two worlds together, Islamic and Christian, is not just their doctrine, but their duality, the balance of ethics and emotion, law and law. They built rules to manage the unknown. They wrapped the monthly rhythm in cloth, in privacy, in prayer. Sometimes that cloth felt like protection. Other times, it felt like a veil. And in both cases, the menstruating body was never truly forgotten. It was watched, measured, managed, but rarely named. Its voice came through mothers, through healers, through glances across rooms where daughters sat quietly, learning by watching. That silence was not always cruel, but it was heavy, and that weight, carried for centuries, shaped not just how menstruation was understood, but how women saw themselves. Not unclean, not unworthy, but unwelcome in the public script, even when they were central to the story. In medieval Europe, menstruation was never simply a fact of the body. It was a matter of moral consequence, spiritual unease, and eventually demonic suspicion. The ideas did not appear all at once. They formed gradually, fed by theology, folklore, and centuries of inherited fear. To understand how menstruation became entangled with witchcraft, we must begin with the perception of menstrual blood itself. By the 12th century, Galenic medicine, inherited from the classical world, still held sway. The theory of humours remained dominant. Women were colder, wetter, and more passive in body and spirit. Menstrual blood in this framework was waste, an excess of corrupted nourishment that the female body could not refine into semen or vitality. It needed to be expelled monthly, or risk causing illness. But medieval texts often went further. Menstrual blood was not just waste, it was dangerous. In bestiaries it was said to sour wine, rust iron, cloud mirrors. In farming manuals it could cause fruit to fall from trees, seeds to die in the soil, or bees to abandon their hives. These were not metaphors, they were printed as facts. Copied, recopied, passed down in monastic scriptoria and university halls. The idea was clear. This blood had power, and power, in a woman's hands, especially one alone, or old, or childless, was rarely seen as benign. As Christian theology deepened its reach into daily life, menstruation became not just medical, but moral. The blood became a symbol, a mark of Eve's disobedience, a monthly reminder of humanity's fall from grace. Theologians like Thomas Aquinas debated whether menstrual blood could transmit sin or affect sacramental purity. Church canons advised that menstruating women avoid communion, sacred relics, and holy water. Some parishes enforced these restrictions strictly, others less so, but the belief lingered. Bleeding meant unclean, and when that belief intersected with broader anxieties about women's roles, sexuality, and secrecy, it created a volatile mixture. By the late medieval period, especially during moments of crisis, famine, plague, war, women who stood apart from the norm were watched more closely. The midwife, the widow, the herbalist, the one who didn't attend mass, the one who knew which herbs to use for cramping, or how to bring on a late period with a hot poultice and a bitter root. She wasn't always feared. Sometimes she was cherished, respected, but always noticed. Rise of witchcraft accusations did not begin with menstruation, but menstruation was folded into the broader suspicion of female bodies, bodies that bled, that birthed, that changed without explanation. The Malleus Maleficarum, published in 1487 by two Dominican inquisitors, became the most infamous guide to identifying witches. It described women as more credulous, more carnal, and more likely to consort with devils. Though it didn't focus specifically on menstruation, its framework made space for every bodily function to be reinterpreted as spiritual threat. Menstrual blood, in this worldview, became not just inconvenient, it became supernatural. Some trials from the period included allegations that women used menstrual blood in love potions, hexes, or curses. It was believed that a woman could anoint clothing with her blood to bind a man's affections or destroy them. In rural folklore, red cloth tucked under a lover's bed might cause madness or obsession. In others, blood sprinkled in a field might ruin a harvest. Much of this wasn't theology, it was folk belief. Oral, regional, shaped by rumour more than scripture. But when combined with church-led panic and legal authority, these whispers could, and did, become death sentences. Even outside the realm of witch trials, menstruation was surrounded by suspicion. In some village records, girls who began menstruating too early were believed to have been touched by unnatural forces. A 12-year-old who bled before her peers might be whispered about. A woman who didn't bleed at all might be accused of harbouring something worse, and those who bled irregularly, who bled during pregnancy, or not during it, who claimed to bleed too long, or not at all, they became mysteries, and in medieval Europe, mysteries that couldn't be solved were often punished. Some women protected themselves by hiding their symptoms, feigning sickness, or blaming other causes. Others leaned into their roles as healers, using their knowledge to shield themselves with community trust. But that trust could break quickly. One bad harvest, one fever in the Lord's child, one miscarriage, one curious stain noticed on laundry, and the air would shift. It's important to remember that not every town was hostile, not every priest was cruel, not every healer was hunted. There were women who bled, gave birth, aged and died without ever being accused, without ever being feared, but they all lived within a framework that saw their blood not as sacred or neutral, but as risky. Menstrual blood was never publicly honoured. It was not part of ritual. It was not named in songs. It was not carved in chapel stone. Instead, it was wrapped in linen, burned in fire pits, hidden from record. Even saints, women whose bodily suffering was often revered, were expected to transcend menstruation. Bleeding from stigmata, holy. Bleeding from the womb, not discussed. Some mystics reportedly lost their periods as they entered religious ecstasy. Others had visions in which their bleeding was transformed into metaphor, into roses, into wine. The body had to be rewritten, made fit for sainthood, and that rewriting often meant erasure. There were, however, glimpses of resistance. In medical manuscripts, some anonymous scribes included menstrual treatments with calm precision, recipes for pain relief, lists of herbs and poultices, advice on cloth folding. These texts rarely moralized. They observed, they recorded. In women's letters, menstrual rhythms sometimes appeared in code. My month has come, I cannot attend, the moon has troubled me. The language may have been veiled, but it was present. The silence was never total, and in folklore, the bleeding woman sometimes held power, not always feared, sometimes revered. The woman who could calm storms, the woman whose touch stopped a fever, the woman who knew the red root from the black one. Superstition, yes, but also memory, a flicker of an older world, where bleeding was not a curse, but a sign. What's most striking is not just the fear, but the forgetting. As the centuries moved forward, the blood faded further from the record. Witches stopped being burned. Midwives were absorbed into the state. Medicine became male again, and menstruation returned to what it had been before, private, hidden, managed. But that moment in the late Middle Ages, when a woman could be accused of sorcery simply for understanding her own body, left a scar, not visible, but deep. It taught generations that the natural could be monstrous, that knowing could be punished, that blood could be both source and evidence of guilt, and it taught women to whisper, to fold the cloth twice, to bury the herbs deeper in the jar, to pass the knowledge without eye contact, because even if the danger passed, the memory remained. In some parts of the world, a woman's bleeding days meant rest. In others, they meant retreat. Whether shaped by reverence, fear, or practicality, many societies developed rituals of isolation around menstruation, complex systems of space, time, and silence that redefined a woman's place in the home, in the village, in the world. These practices did not always emerge from cruelty. Some were born from spiritual frameworks, from a belief in cosmic rhythms, from the sense that blood, especially this kind of blood, had its own gravity. But the result was often the same. A girl would wake one morning and find herself gently moved outside the center of life. For a few days, she belonged elsewhere. In Nepal, this elsewhere had a name, Chaupadi. Rooted in centuries of tradition, the practice required menstruating women and girls to live in small huts, often no more than lean-tos made of stone or mud, separated from the main household. They would sleep there, eat there, and wait out their bleeding days in solitude. Some huts had no windows, some had no bedding. In the mountains, where nights dropped below freezing, this isolation could turn dangerous. Chaupadi was based on the belief that menstrual blood could pollute not just individuals but entire communities. Cows might stop giving milk, crops might fail, gods might be offended. Women in their periods were barred from touching communal water, entering kitchens, or even coming into contact with male relatives. If a girl had younger brothers, she could not hold them. If her mother was sick, she could not cook her food. The practice was banned in 2005 and criminalized in 2017. But in many rural areas the custom persists, not just through law but through memory. It is not always forced. In some families, girls accept it as part of life, even speak of it with a strange fondness, the solitude, the time to themselves, the quiet. But the risks are real. Snake bites, hypothermia, fires lit to keep warm in tiny airless spaces, and always the silence. In Ethiopia, a different form of menstrual seclusion emerged among the Beta Israel community. Ethiopian Jews who maintained unique religious practices across centuries of cultural separation. Their tradition dictated that menstruating women live in Mergum Gogo, small huts set apart from the village. Unlike in Chaupadi, these spaces were often built intentionally, sometimes even with care. Women would gather there not alone, but together. They told stories, shared food, rested. In this context, isolation was both restriction and refuge. It acknowledged the blood, yes, but it also offered a place where women could exist without performance, without cooking, cleaning, caretaking. The world paused around them, not erased, just shifted. In some interpretations, the Mergum Gogo was a spiritual retreat. Women were seen as temporarily sacred, too holy perhaps for the ordinary, and when they returned, they bathed in spring water, put on fresh clothes, and rejoined the rhythms of the home. The boundary was symbolic, but it was real. Across the Pacific, among indigenous North American tribes, menstruation was often surrounded by deeply spiritual rituals, though practices varied greatly by region and nation. Among the Dinéna Navajo, the Kinaldar ceremony marked a girl's first period as a time of transformation. It was a rite of passage, guided by elder women who taught the girl how to grind corn, knead dough, braid hair. She was not cast out but prepared, strengthened. Yet, during regular menstruation, many tribes observed periods of quiet withdrawal, not shame, but reverence. The Apache, Ojibwe, and Lakota practiced forms of menstrual isolation that framed women as especially powerful during this time. Their energy was believed to be heightened, their connection to the spiritual realm more intense. In this state, they might disrupt the harmony of certain rituals, not because they were unclean, but because they carried too much power, so they withdrew, sat apart in moon lodges, often built from bark or hide. There they were tended by other women, offered rest, warmth, food. They meditated, reflected, spoke with the ancestors. When they emerged, they brought their stories back with them. In Japan, during the Heian period and beyond, menstruation was marked by both ritual purity and social inconvenience. Shinto beliefs classified menstrual blood as kagare, impurity, not in the sense of moral failure, but as a deviation from spiritual balance, a natural discharge of internal imbalance to be acknowledged and purified. Women of the court often observed seclusion rituals, though not always with harshness. A noble woman might remain in a separate wing of the house. She would not approach altars or participate in festivals, but she would be brought meals, allowed time to read, to write poetry, to rest. In rural Shinto practice, menstruating women were restricted from entering certain shrines or participating in kagura dances, thought to be too spiritually volatile. Yet paradoxically, some kami, Shinto deities, were themselves associated with blood, fertility, and birth. The contradiction was not resolved, it simply coexisted. In Orthodox Jewish traditions, the laws of Niddah governed menstruation and its aftermath with structured clarity. A woman during her cycle, and for 7 days following it, refrained from physical intimacy with her husband. She observed a form of ritual distancing, not isolation in the physical sense, but a gentle spatial and emotional boundary. After this time, she immersed in a mikveh, a ritual bath, and returned to marital life. While critics have pointed to the potential psychological toll of these laws, many women within Orthodox communities speak of Niddah as a rhythm, a return, a space carved into time that allows for reflection and renewal. In this case, the isolation is not external exile, but internal cycle. In medieval Europe, however, the approach grew colder. Influenced by Christian theology and classical medical texts, menstruation was seen as both impure and dangerous. Women were discouraged from entering churches, handling sacred objects, or preparing communion bread. In some parishes, they sat in separate pews. In others, they were expected to stay home altogether. But few women had the luxury of true seclusion. They still worked, still tended children, still bled quietly while hauling water or kneading bread. The ritual, in many cases, was a social suggestion more than a personal pause, and the result was not rest, but erasure. In Indonesia, among the Balinese, menstruation intersects with Hindu Balinese cosmology in intricate ways. Women are discouraged from entering temples or participating in religious ceremonies during their cycle. Temple priests, considered spiritually vulnerable, are forbidden from coming into contact with menstrual blood or even standing downwind from menstruating women. Here, the isolation is spatial, invisible. It lives in pathways, doorways, breath. But again, within the home, there is often understanding. Mothers tell daughters what to avoid, not with scorn, but with care. The boundary is maintained, but not always enforced with shame. Across Tamil Nadu, in southern India, traditional customs around menstruation included temporary seclusion, especially at menarche. A girl's first period was marked with ceremonies, gifts, and a short stay in a designated room. She would be pampered, taught household customs, fed rich foods. Some saw it as celebration, others as restriction dressed in gold. In everyday cycles, women in more orthodox households refrained from entering kitchens or temples. They slept on mats away from others. But like in many cultures, these customs were uneven, intensely followed in one home, gently ignored in another. What links all of these practices, scattered across deserts, forests, cities and plains, is the idea that menstruation makes a woman different, not just biologically, but spiritually, socially, ritually. That for a few days each month, she steps outside the usual frame. Sometimes, that step is treated with kindness, a pause, a breath, a chance to gather oneself. Other times, it's treated with suspicion, as something that must be hidden, managed, removed, and in most cases, the act of isolation, whether physical or symbolic, is wrapped in the language of care, protection, balance. But care can carry weight. A hut without a window can be called sacred. A rule made for safety can still leave a girl cold, and silence, even when spoken softly, can still echo. In these rituals, across cultures, one truth is clear: menstruation was not ignored, it was watched, controlled, framed. Women were never merely left alone, they were placed, and sometimes that made all the difference. Throughout most of history, menstruation happened in silence, not because it didn't matter, but because it wasn't supposed to show. While kings waged wars and merchants signed treaties, women folded rags in the dark, boiled linens, scraped blood from cloth with lye and soap root. This was not just bodily maintenance, it was labour. Repetitive, private, and almost entirely undocumented. What tools were used? What customs did women follow to manage something that came monthly for decades of their lives? The answers rarely made it into books or scrolls, but if you look closely, in the footnotes, the archaeological debris, the margins of medical texts, you begin to see the outlines of an entire infrastructure, hidden, practical, essential. Long before commercial pads and tampons, the body was managed through craft and improvisation. In ancient Egypt, evidence suggests the use of softened papyrus rolled into plugs. These may have functioned similarly to internal absorbents, perhaps an early version of what we might call tampons today, though without applicators or standard shapes. There are no detailed instructions, just fragments. A medical papyrus here, a burial item there, enough to suggest a system built from what was available. In Greece and Rome, wool played a central role. Midwives and physicians described tampons made from lint or wool, sometimes soaked in herbal mixtures, vinegar, wine, or even cedar oil for additional properties. Hippocrates refers vaguely to wool-wrapped sticks used vaginally, though it's debated whether this was for menstruation, contraception, or ritual cleansing. Roman women likely reused cloth pads, washing and drying them between cycles. These were referred to simply as menstrual rags, not out of insult, but because that's what they were. And washing them wasn't simple. In the absence of antiseptics, women turned to boiling water, sunlight, and plant-based soaps, ash, lye, soapwort, crushed barley. The labour was quiet but constant. Drying cloths had to be hidden, not because they were shameful, but because they marked a woman's private timeline. A girl could be teased for it, a widow pitied, a childless woman questioned. The cloth spoke, even when she didn't. In medieval Europe, linen was the material of choice for those who could afford it. Poorer women relied on rougher fabrics, hemp, wool, even moss or peat. Archaeological digs in bogs and middens occasionally turn up remnants, shredded cloth tucked between layers of undergarments, woven belts stained and stiff. These were not elegant solutions, but they worked. Some women fashioned menstrual belts, straps that held absorbent rags close to the body, anchored at the waist or between the thighs. These belts could be made from braided cloth, soft rope, or leather. They needed frequent adjusting and often caused chafing, but they were reusable and adaptable. There is no consensus on how commonly these were worn. Some historians argue that women in colder climates who wore multiple layers and long dresses simply bled into their clothes or onto hay stuffed beneath them. Others insist on the ubiquity of washable pads, passed down from mother to daughter with instructions not written but spoken. In India, traditional methods included the use of old cotton saris, torn into soft squares and folded into thick layers. These were washed, sun-dried and stored discreetly. In some regions, women dried these cloths under the bed or in shadowed corners, fearful that public drying might attract curses or gossip. The sun, while a natural disinfectant, was sometimes off-limits because menstrual blood was believed to carry spiritual impurity that should not touch sacred elements like sunlight. Yet even this caution was layered. In Ayurvedic texts, menstruation was treated as a cleansing process. The body was ridding itself of excess doshas, of internal heat. Management of this process involved not just cloth, but dietary changes, oils and rest. Warm sesame oil rubbed into the lower abdomen, coriander teas, and hot baths were recommended to ease discomfort. The cloth was only one part of a larger embodied ritual. In China, ancient records mention the use of soft paper or cotton wadding. Upper-class women may have had access to silk rags, though these were rare and impractical for cleaning. Among peasant women, straw or ash-packed cloths were used. Like in other parts of the world, absorbency was more important than softness. Layers mattered, so did the ability to rinse and reuse. Written documentation in Chinese medical texts often focuses more on the regulation of menstruation than the management of its byproducts. Herbal remedies to stimulate or suppress flow were more commonly discussed than what to wear or how to clean. This reflects a broader trend. Management was women's work, passed outside the academy, preserved not in writing but in habit. In Islamic societies, menstruation was acknowledged in legal and hygienic texts with more openness than in many Christian contexts. Women used cloth pads called kursuf and were instructed on how to purify themselves after their cycle. Scholars like Ar-Razi and Ibn Sina Avicenna offered advice on managing pain, regulating flow, and maintaining hygiene. Menstrual cloths were washed thoroughly, often with cedar leaves or camphor, and dried in private spaces. Some texts even outline specific du'as, prayers to be said after washing, reflecting a fusion of bodily and spiritual cleanliness. In wealthier households, women may have had designated attendants to help manage their garments. In rural areas, the work fell entirely to the individual. Among indigenous peoples across the Americas, practices varied widely. Some bled freely onto natural materials like moss, animal pelts, or woven grass mats. Others crafted intricate cloths from plant fibers. The emphasis was less on concealment and more on integration of the menstrual cycle into the rhythms of daily and spiritual life. In the Arctic, Inuit women lined their undergarments with caribou moss, prized for its absorbency and warmth. These linings were changed regularly and dried carefully, often over heated stones. The cold made quick drying essential. Wet cloth could freeze, causing injury or infection. Throughout sub-Saharan Africa, women used banana leaves, folded bark, or handmade cloth pads tied with string. In some communities, girls learned how to make their first pads from older sisters or aunts. These lessons were often playful, communal, a moment of shared craft rather than solemn instruction. In each of these societies, menstrual management required time. Water had to be fetched, fires lit, soaps prepared, cloth stitched. These tasks were rarely acknowledged in public discourse, but they shaped the rhythms of women's lives as much as any ritual or law. They also created economies. In large households, menstruating women might be temporarily relieved of certain tasks, allowing others, often younger girls or older women, to take over. Midwives sold herbs not just for childbirth, but for regulating cycles and easing pain. Laundresses dealt with stains without comment. Mothers passed down methods for folding, soaking, reusing. By the 19th century, industrialization began to change the landscape. Absorbent cotton became more available. Ready-made cloth pads were marketed in women's magazines, sometimes as hygienic towels or ladies' comfort bands. These were often expensive, marketed to middle-class women, and accompanied by euphemistic language that avoided any mention of blood. Disposables followed in the early 20th century, first with nurses' bandages repurposed by soldiers' wives, then with branded products like Kotex, made from surplus surgical gauze. But even as technology advanced, silence remained. Women were still expected to hide the evidence, to wrap pads in newspaper, to avoid hanging cloths in visible places, to whisper if they needed supplies. That silence, the habit of making labour invisible, continued, and so, even today, much of this history remains fragmented, scattered across anthropology journals, buried in museum archives, or preserved in the memories of grandmothers who stitched cloths in secret. But the labour was real, the hands that scrubbed, the fingers that folded, the backs that bent over boiling pots. That was menstrual management, not abstract, not metaphorical, but physical work, every month, for a lifetime. It was unpaid, often unspoken, and always necessary. The Victorians had a way of pretending the body didn't exist, not in its rawness, not in its fluids, not in its mess. Everything was draped, perfumed, corseted into compliance. Politeness was a shield, decorum a religion, and beneath it all, women bled quietly into layers of muslin, folded and pinned beneath petticoats, and never spoke of it again. By the mid-19th century, Britain had entered a fever pitch of hygiene. Advances in public sanitation, germ theory, and medical understanding collided with deep-seated moral anxiety. Cleanliness became more than just a virtue. It became a marker of spiritual and social purity, and nothing unsettled that vision more than menstruation. Doctors began publishing treatises about the female reproductive system, not just to study it, but to manage it. Menstrual blood, already surrounded by cultural taboo, was now cast as dangerous, not in the magical or spiritual sense as it had been in earlier centuries, but as a form of internal pollution, something that needed regulation, restraint, and above all, concealment. The result was a new etiquette, an unspoken but rigorously enforced code for how menstruating women should behave, dress, and manage themselves. There were no formal manuals. You wouldn't find it printed on etiquette cards or taught at finishing schools, but it was everywhere, passed from mother to daughter, whispered between friends, enforced by disapproving glances and subtle absences. Women were expected to maintain absolute discretion. No stains, no smells, no signs. Linens had to be folded and hidden away. If a pad or cloth was seen, even drying near the hearth, it was a scandal. In some households, girls were scolded for washing their menstrual cloths with the family laundry. In others, they were instructed to burn them outright. And yet the tools themselves were deeply unsophisticated. Commercial menstrual products were still in their infancy. Most women relied on homemade rags, cut from old flannel petticoats or muslin underlayers. These were folded thick, pinned to belts or threaded through loops, sewn into drawers. They shifted often. They leaked. They required constant attention. Washing them was another matter. Some women soaked them in cold water overnight, using lye or carbolic soap. Others boiled them discreetly in the kitchen, when no one else was around. But even this practical act carried a sense of shame. Water-tinted pink had to be thrown away quickly. Buckets were hidden, stains scrubbed until fingers ached. Middle-class women were under especially intense pressure. They were expected to uphold the ideals of feminine refinement, to maintain pristine appearances even when their own bodies betrayed them. Servants and working-class women, while subject to different standards, had their own forms of vigilance. In factories and domestic service, managing menstruation was a logistical nightmare. There were no breaks, no sanitary facilities. Women bled into layered cloths and worked through the pain. There are letters, rare but revealing, where women mention these struggles. One young seamstress wrote of having to sit in her own blood for hours during long shifts. Another described how she kept scraps of cloth sewn into the lining of her skirts, just in case. By the 1870s, some commercial solutions began to appear. The Hoosier sanitary belt and Lister's towels, the latter named after Joseph Lister, a pioneer of antiseptic surgery, offered disposable options, but these were expensive, marketed primarily to wealthier women, and often viewed with skepticism. Many doctors believed women should not interfere too much with their natural cycles. Others feared that new products would encourage immodesty. Advertisements for these early products used coded language. Words like hygienic, refined, and protection replaced any direct mention of blood or menstruation. Women were shown lounging in white gowns, surrounded by flowers and lace. The reality was far more visceral, but the illusion had to be maintained. Victorian medicine compounded the problem. Menstruation was often pathologized. Female patients were told their periods made them weak, unstable, or unfit for intellectual labor. Some doctors claimed menstruating women should avoid reading, walking too much, or even thinking too deeply. The uterus, they said, was easily disturbed. It could wander. It could turn inward. It could cause hysteria. These ideas filtered into education. Girls were warned not to strain themselves during their cycles. Physical exertion, they were told, might damage their chances of motherhood. In some boarding schools, girls were required to lie down during their periods, wrapped in blankets, given milk and bread, and told to rest in silence. But even in these spaces, the subject was taboo. Girls whispered about it, guessed at each other's cycles, learned more from peers than from any adult. Mothers passed on practical knowledge with immense discretion. Some gave their daughters small bundles of cloth and whispered instructions on how to pin them into place. Others avoided the topic altogether, leaving girls to discover it alone. Diaries from the period reveal moments of confusion, fear, even shame when a girl first bled. It was rarely a moment of celebration. Pain management, too, was inconsistent. Some women brewed teas with pennyroyal, raspberry leaf or chamomile. Others were given opiates, laudanum or morphine to dull the worst cramps. But many simply endured it. Stoicism was expected, complaining discouraged. Despite the silence, menstruation shaped daily life. Women planned travel around it, avoided social events, declined dances and dinners. If a woman was pale or sluggish, it was often chalked up to nerves or female troubles. But no one asked directly. Men, for the most part, remained entirely unaware. Fathers, brothers, husbands were not expected to know the details. Even doctors often spoke to mothers or older sisters, not the patient herself. This exclusion only deepened the isolation. A woman could be married, raising children, managing a household, and still never speak of her own menstrual needs aloud. Victorian literature offers only faint traces of this world. Female characters faint, grow pale, take to bed, but menstruation is never named. Even novels that detail childbirth or illness shy away from this monthly fact. It was too ordinary, too intimate, too real. And yet, the evidence is there, in laundry ledgers, in medical records, in the fine print of ladies' magazines, an entire architecture of care, shame and adaptation, built quietly, rebuilt monthly, always in the background. Menstruation in the Victorian age was not just a private matter. It was a test of a woman's virtue, her cleanliness, her ability to manage discomfort without complaint. It was one more way she proved herself worthy of her station. And if she failed, if she stained a chair, missed a social call, or complained of cramps, she was marked, if only subtly, as less refined. This pressure carved itself into posture, into gait, into the way women sat, dressed, moved through the world. It taught stillness, grace under strain, the art of appearing untouched by anything as inconvenient as the body. And it worked, so well in fact, that the legacy remains. Even now, traces of that Victorian silence persist, in the way products are advertised, in the way discomfort is downplayed, in the way the word itself, menstruation, is still softened, avoided, turned into euphemism. What the Victorians created wasn't just etiquette, it was erasure, a system so effective, so disciplined, that it taught generations how to disappear a fact of life. And behind every spotless dress, every untouched cushion, every polite smile through the ache, there was a woman doing the work, quietly, repeatedly, alone. The first period was never just a biological shift. It was a social sentence, a signal that the body had changed, and with it, so had expectations. In many cultures, the arrival of menstruation wasn't met with open arms or explanation, but with silence, a silence shaped by fear, duty, modesty, and the unrelenting pressure to grow up without taking up space. Puberty, for boys, was often a step into public life, voice deepening, limbs lengthening, celebrated in stories of strength and future manhood. But for girls, the transition was inward, quiet, managed, watched, and nowhere was that more evident than in the way society responded to menarche, the first bleed. In Victorian England, a girl's first period marked the beginning of what was often called her season of discretion. She was now eligible, if not for marriage, then for preparation. Corsets tightened, voices lowered, education often shifted from the intellectual to the domestic. Girls were encouraged to focus on their role as future wives and mothers. Talk of menstruation, if it happened at all, was brief, practical, never public. Even in middle-class homes where girls might have been taught embroidery and French, there was rarely any formal education about their bodies. The day blood first appeared, many were terrified. They thought they were injured, dying, or being punished. Diaries from the 19th century are full of vague entries. Felt unwell, took to bed, a change came, all written in the language of avoidance. Mothers sometimes handed down bundles of cloth or quietly mentioned what to do, but these conversations were often more functional than comforting, and in many cases they didn't happen at all. Across Europe, puberty rituals varied. In rural Italy, girls were told to avoid cold water when menstruating, warned it could cause infertility or illness. In Ireland, young girls were kept from milking cows or baking bread during their period, out of fear they'd spoil the food. These warnings weren't just superstition, they reinforced the idea that menstruation made a girl dangerous, that her body, newly fertile, now needed boundaries. The body became a liability, something to control. In early 20th century America, menstruation was framed increasingly through a medical lens. Textbooks described it as a necessary inconvenience, an internal house-cleaning process that marked the beginning of womanhood. But the tone was clinical, detached. Girls were expected to be hygienic, quiet, and self-contained. School pamphlets encouraged them to keep active, to smile, to maintain a pleasant disposition. Pain and discomfort were to be endured without complaint. Meanwhile, the silence deepened. Teachers skipped over chapters. Doctors addressed parents instead of the girls themselves. The language of menstruation became coded. The curse. That time, visitors. The more polite the phrase, the more profound the shame beneath it. In India, the onset of menstruation marked a stark shift. For many girls, particularly in conservative or rural areas, it meant the end of play, the end of childhood, in any form that resembled freedom. Suddenly, she was told to sit a certain way, dress differently, avoid boys, even brothers or cousins. Religious practices were restricted. She might not be allowed into temples, kitchens, or even shared living spaces during her cycle. A celebration might be held, especially in South Indian communities, where a girl's menarche was marked with gifts, sweets, new clothing. But beneath the surface of these rituals was a tight braid of expectation. Her time was no longer her own. She had entered the realm of control. In Japan, traditional beliefs about menstruation being spiritually impure meant that young girls learned early to avoid shrines and sacred spaces during their period. But more than that, they learned how not to speak of it. In the delicate etiquette of Japanese society, bodily functions were carefully concealed. The first period might be acknowledged in private, with a few gentle instructions, but it would not be mentioned again. Silence wasn't always neglect. Sometimes it was seen as protection. Adults wanted to shield girls from embarrassment, from overexposure, but the result was often the same. Girls were left alone to make sense of their changing bodies, to manage blood and fear in the dark. In West African cultures, menarche sometimes marked a girl's readiness for initiation rites. These were not inherently negative. Many were celebratory, teaching about fertility, social roles, and cultural knowledge. But in regions where female genital cutting was practiced, menstruation also triggered a far more violent threshold. The first blood that should have marked a beginning was instead used to justify a procedure meant to limit pleasure, autonomy, and agency. Even where such rituals were absent, the shift was stark. A girl who had just begun menstruating could suddenly be expected to behave like a woman, modest, reserved, hard-working, despite being, in every other way, still a child. In Islamic traditions, the onset of menstruation carried religious implications. The girl was now required to begin praying, fasting during Ramadan, and observing the physical boundaries that accompanied her new status. But these expectations were rarely explained with clarity. Cultural differences meant that in some communities, girls were given detailed guidance. In others, they were left to infer everything from the behavior of others. Across contexts, one message remained consistent. Once you started bleeding, you stopped speaking. Puberty silenced girls in subtle, cumulative ways. It taught them not just to lower their voices, but to doubt them, to treat their pain as unremarkable, their questions as embarrassing, their desires as dangerous. Even in supposedly progressive circles, the body remained taboo. Feminist movements of the 20th century worked to change this, but progress was uneven. For every campaign that celebrated the menstrual cycle as natural and empowering, there were still rows of schoolgirls hiding tampons up their sleeves, afraid to ask for help. Silence became a survival strategy. Say nothing, and you couldn't be shamed. Show nothing, and you couldn't be punished. In the workplace, menstruation was an invisible weight. Women took painkillers, wore black, doubled up on protection. They kept working, smiling, pushing forward. In schools, girls asked to see the nurse with vague complaints, hoping no one would guess the truth. And if they cried in class, if they lost focus, if they snapped, there was always the whisper, "She must be on her period." The blood wasn't just a fact, it was a weapon. To menstruate was to be unreliable, emotional, irrational, unfit for leadership, for public life, for seriousness. The silencing of puberty wasn't always dramatic. It didn't need to be. It lived in posture, in tone, in avoidance. It taught girls to fold themselves inward, physically, socially, emotionally, and once learned, that folding was hard to undo. Some resisted, quietly at first. A girl might pass a note to a friend, share a pad, say the word out loud, just once, and feel the power of naming something that had always been unnamed. Others pushed harder, wrote essays, organized clubs, designed better products, demanded that schools and families do better. These voices grew, decade by decade, each one chipping away at the silence that had once seemed immovable. But even now, the traces remain, in the way we package pain, in the way we label moods, in the way puberty still marks the end of girlhood, not because of what a girl gains, but because of what she loses: freedom, voice, comfort in her own skin. The first blood was never just physical. It was a cultural moment, a shift in how the world looked at her, and how she was told to look at herself, not as a child anymore, but not quite as a person either, just something in transition, watched, measured, silenced. The revolution didn't begin with marches or speeches. It began in hospital corridors, in cotton mills, and inside the quiet minds of women who were tired of managing their cycles with whatever scraps could be spared. Before there were brands, there were bandages, and before there was a market, there was a need, silent, constant, and ignored for centuries. The early 20th century brought war. World War I tore open a new era of suffering and innovation. Nurses on the front lines wrapped the wounded in surgical cotton, absorbent, sterile, and more effective than anything previously used. But when the war ended, an unexpected shift occurred. There were warehouses full of unused medical materials, and a growing awareness among women that those same cotton dressings could serve another purpose. In 1921, Kotex was born, not from a moment of invention, but from repurposing. Kimberly-Clark, the manufacturer, had an oversupply of cellucotton, the gauze-like material used in surgical dressings. It was cheap to make and highly absorbent. Marketing executives took a risk, packaging it into discreet sanitary napkins and placing it on pharmacy shelves under the name Kotex, a blend of cotton and texture. There was no fanfare, no billboards, no public announcements. The first ads were vague, avoiding direct reference to menstruation. Women were instructed to ask for Kotex by name, avoiding embarrassment. Cashiers were told to wrap the box in plain paper, as if selling contraband. Still, the product moved. Women bought it, not in droves at first, but steadily enough that Kotex knew they had found a market long ignored. And they weren't alone. Soon came Modes, Sannap Pak, and a host of smaller competitors. Each offered a variation on the same concept, a disposable pad, worn with a belt, promising convenience and hygiene. These were not comfortable by modern standards, bulky, often unreliable, but they were a step away from boiling rags in secret. Menstrual belts became a staple of the 1930s and 40s. They looped around the waist with hooks or clips to secure the pad in place. They chafed, they shifted, they often failed, but for the first time menstruation was being met with manufactured tools instead of homemade solutions. Still, the stigma lingered. Advertisements were euphemistic to the point of absurdity. Phrases like "for those special days" or "to maintain freshness" floated in delicate script across floral backgrounds. Blood was never mentioned. Women in white dresses danced, played tennis, smiled from bathtubs. The fantasy was frictionless. The reality of leaks, cramps, embarrassment remained unspoken. Schools began offering menstrual education in limited forms. Booklets with pastel covers described womanhood as a season of quiet dignity. Girls were told about the new products available, but rarely shown how to use them. Diagrams, if included, were vague. The burden remained personal. Sanitary products were to be worn, used and disposed of without notice. In many households, a box of pads was kept hidden at the back of a drawer. Girls would learn where it was through whispers, not instructions. And in poorer families, commercial products were simply unaffordable. Cloth remained the norm. A girl with a single pad might rinse and reuse it for weeks. Then, in 1931, a woman named Earl Haas patented a new device. It was made of compressed cotton and came with a cardboard applicator. His invention, the tampon, initially called Tampax, it was quietly marketed as a product for modern women, particularly nurses, dancers and athletes who needed more mobility. But cultural resistance was strong. Some doctors warned that tampons could damage virginity. Others claimed they were unsanitary, and many mothers forbade their daughters from using them, believing it would make them too comfortable with their own bodies. Despite the pushback, tampons grew in popularity. By the 1940s and 50s, they were a viable option for women who wanted more discretion and control. Magazine ads depicted slim, confident women, less flowery, more professional. A subtle shift was happening. The narrative was moving from shame to self-management. Still, access was uneven. In many rural or conservative areas, tampons were never discussed. Some pharmacies refused to stock them, and until the late 20th century, they were rarely included in school education materials. Girls learnt through trial and error, often from friends, rarely from adults. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, the menstrual product market expanded. Sanitary napkins became thinner, more adhesive. Belts gave way to pads with sticky strips. Plastic applicators replaced cardboard. Innovations trickled in, but advertising stayed the same, sanitized, coded, perpetually wrapped in metaphor. Then came the 1970s. Second-wave feminism began to challenge the silence. Activists asked why menstruation was still treated as shameful, why girls were still whispering in hallways, why so many products were made by men and marketed by men to women who weren't being consulted. Pamphlets and zines appeared, criticizing the menstrual industry for its lack of transparency. Some questioned the safety of tampons, others pushed for reusable products, and behind it all was the growing realization that menstruation wasn't just a personal issue, it was political. The toxic shock syndrome scare of the early 1980s turned attention sharply towards safety. Linked to certain high-absorbency tampons, TSS prompted FDA regulation and a re-evaluation of product materials. Manufacturers were forced to include warnings, and many women returned to external pads or experimented with cloth alternatives. By the late 1980s and 90s, new options emerged. Reusable cloth pads, Often handmade and sold through underground feminist networks, the menstrual cup, first developed in the 1930s, was resurrected and slowly gained popularity. It offered a radically different experience, internal, sustainable, cost-effective, but required a level of comfort with the body that many still struggled with. In every phase, product evolution was shaped not just by science, but by social norms. The birth of sanitary products was never purely about convenience. It was about control, who had it, who sold it, who shaped the narrative around it. Even today, this tension remains. Marketing still leans into cleanliness, neutrality, discretion, blue liquid in ads, whisper soft wrappers, euphemisms about leak protection and confidence. The legacy of the ragtime revolution is visible in every pharmacy aisle, but so is its restraint. Yet, what those early products did, imperfect as they were, was open the door. They acknowledged the reality of menstruation as something that deserved infrastructure, that merited design, that wasn't just to be endured, but addressed. The women who stitched rags in silence, who boiled water by candlelight, who bled into moss and linen, they built the groundwork. The nurses who repurposed bandages, the girls who whispered in bathrooms, the mothers who tucked pads into pockets without a word. They were not passive recipients of change. They were its origin. The ragtime revolution was not a single moment. It was a tide, slow, persistent, and inevitable. It reshaped the marketplace. It reshaped the conversation. And though the silence around menstruation hasn't disappeared, the tools forged in those decades gave women something more than just absorbency. They gave them options, and slowly, quietly, options became power. When the tampon was introduced to the public in the 1930s, it didn't just offer a new product, it sparked a cultural fault line. Small, discreet, and internal, it promised freedom from belts, pads, and bulky fabric. But it also unsettled a carefully preserved hierarchy of modesty, purity, and control, especially in communities where the body was governed not just by biology, but by doctrine. At the heart of the controversy wasn't the tampon itself, it was the idea of what it meant to insert something into the body. For generations, girls had been taught to manage menstruation quietly, externally. Cloth rags, pinned napkins, disposable pads, all of them sat safely outside the body, symbolically and literally preserving a certain distance. The tampon blurred that line. When Earl Haas patented the first commercial tampon with an applicator in 1931, he designed it as a medical device, something that could provide sanitary relief for active women. By the late 1930s, Tampax began marketing it toward nurses, athletes, dancers, women who needed movement, discretion, and reliability. But as soon as tampons entered mainstream discussion, resistance emerged from religious, medical, and cultural quarters. One of the earliest objections came from the Catholic Church, which questioned the tampon's implications for virginity. The hymen, long held as a symbol of moral purity despite its medical irrelevance, became the battlefield. Could a tampon rupture it? If so, could it be considered a violation of virginity, even outside sexual context? In many Catholic households, the answer was yes. Mothers discouraged their daughters from using tampons until marriage, fearing both physical damage and symbolic loss. Even if the hymen remained intact, the idea of a girl touching herself, inserting something into her own body, was often framed as inappropriate. It wasn't about menstruation, it was about control over intimacy. This tension wasn't exclusive to Catholicism. In Orthodox Judaism, laws of niddah govern menstruation and ritual purity. A menstruating woman is traditionally considered in a state of impurity, and is forbidden from physical intimacy with her husband until she undergoes a ritual bath, mikveh, after her cycle ends. These laws emphasize external observation, staining, flow, and cessation. Tampons, by reducing visible bleeding and internalizing the process, complicated how these rules were interpreted. Some rabbis discouraged tampon use, arguing that it could obstruct accurate tracking of menstrual flow or potentially violate the spirit of modesty. Others, more modern in their interpretation, allowed it under certain circumstances, especially for unmarried women or athletes. But the hesitation remained, and within many Orthodox communities, external pads were still the norm. In Islamic jurisprudence, menstruation is also surrounded by rules regarding prayer, fasting, and ritual cleanliness. While there is no explicit ban on tampons in foundational texts, interpretations vary. Some scholars have argued against them on the basis that inserting a foreign object might be unnecessary, or that it could stimulate the body in ways considered inappropriate. Others view tampon use as permissible, so long as it doesn't cause harm or interfere with religious observance. What united these perspectives, regardless of theology, was a deep concern over bodily boundaries. Tampons represented autonomy, the idea that a girl could manage her own cycle internally, privately, without external signs or permissions, and that autonomy made many uncomfortable. Beyond religion, medical authorities also weighed in, often from a place of ignorance or cultural bias. Early 20th century doctors debated whether tampons were safe for young girls. Some claimed that inserting tampons might create psychological confusion. Others warned, without evidence, that tampon use could lead to increased sexual curiosity or moral looseness. These warnings were not about health, they were about maintaining control. Even tampon advertisements reflected this discomfort. While companies like Tampax began advertising in magazines in the 1940s and 50s, they carefully avoided direct language. Phrases like "for modern women" or "freedom for active days" danced around the product's purpose. Diagrams were minimal, instructions were printed discreetly inside the box, and mothers, often the gatekeepers of menstrual knowledge, were left to decide whether the product was acceptable for their daughters. Many said no. Stories from the mid-20th century are full of teenage girls sneaking tampons into bathrooms, hiding them from parents, or asking friends to explain how to use them. Even in households with access to education and income, the tampon was often framed as a symbol of rebellion, something fast, loose, or inappropriate for good girls. The stigma took decades to erode. During the feminist movements of the 1970s, tampons became a battleground. Women began openly discussing menstruation, bodily autonomy, and the need for better products. Some embraced tampons as a sign of empowerment. Others critiqued them for being developed and sold by male-dominated corporations, pointing out the lack of transparency around materials and safety testing. Then came the toxic shock syndrome crisis. In the late 1970s and early 80s, a sharp rise in TSS cases linked to high absorbency tampons left in for extended periods caused panic. The media coverage was intense, often dramatic. Some women switched back to pads. Others demanded better labeling and safer design. Tampon boxes began including clear warnings. The controversy, while medical in origin, reignited cultural concerns. Was it safe? Was it necessary? Should women really be putting these things inside their bodies? Religious groups seized on the crisis to double down on their warnings. Parents became more cautious. Some schools removed tampon samples from health education programs. The silence returned, but only briefly. By the 1990s and early 2000s, tampon use had normalized significantly, at least in Western countries. Product innovation continued. Organic cotton, plastic applicators, scented and unscented options. Yet the cultural divide remained. In many global regions, tampons were still rare, still taboo, still viewed with suspicion. In parts of Asia, tampons were slow to gain traction. Cultural modesty, combined with conservative family structures, meant that most girls grew up using pads. In Japan and Korea, for example, tampon sales lagged far behind pad sales well into the 21st century. A girl using tampons might be seen as fast or immodest, and in schools, menstrual education rarely covered internal products. In India, tampons remain largely inaccessible outside of urban centres. Myths persist, that they affect virginity, that they cause infection, that they are foreign or unnecessary. For many girls, even pads are unaffordable. Tampons, where available, are a luxury item, a symbol not just of autonomy, but of class. The tampon, in short, became more than a product. It became a mirror, reflecting how societies understand the body, control access to information, and assign moral value to choices that should be personal. Even today, tampon controversies continue. In some religious schools, they are discouraged or outright banned. In sports, questions still arise about whether girls should be taught to use them. In media, the product is rarely shown, still too intimate for prime time. But the resistance has met its match. Online communities, health educators and activists are reclaiming the conversation. They use the word tampon without apology. They explain insertion with clarity. They answer questions that generations were too ashamed to ask. The taboo hasn't disappeared, but it's losing its grip. Every girl who tries a tampon for the first time and realizes she is not broken, not dirty, not wrong, she unravels the narrative just a little more. Every parent who talks openly, every teacher who includes tampons in a health lesson, every athlete who competes without fear of leaks, they redraw the boundaries of what is considered normal, and in those small cumulative acts the controversies fade, not because they are erased, but because they are outgrown. The tampon never asked for reverence, only recognition, and for the right to be just what it is, a tool, not a sin, not a statement, just a tool for managing a cycle older than language itself. War has always redrawn the boundaries of necessity, and yet, in every trench, every bunker, every field hospital, one truth held quietly and stubbornly: women bled. Not from wounds or shrapnel alone, but from bodies continuing their ancient rhythms amid the chaos of global conflict. Menstruation didn't pause for bullets or borders, and still, it remained one of the least discussed aspects of war. During World War I, women entered military spaces not as soldiers, but as nurses and volunteers. They cared for the wounded, managed hospitals, organized supplies, and menstruated in silence. There were no issued products, no protocols. The British Voluntary Aid Detachment nurses, for instance, were expected to bring their own supplies, homemade cloth rags, safety pins, extra skirts. In the mud and cold of makeshift tents, these women had to wash their used cloths by hand, often in shared basins, often without privacy. Blood had to be rinsed out discreetly, dried in secret. There was no allowance for pain, fatigue, or leaks. You kept working, you kept quiet. If you stained your uniform, you scrubbed it yourself. No one talked about it. By World War II, women's roles expanded. In Britain, the Auxiliary Territorial Service and Women's Land Army brought thousands of women into active service roles. In the Soviet Union, female snipers, medics, and pilots joined the Red Army. In the US, Waves and WACS took on clerical and logistical support. But with new uniforms and responsibilities came old problems. No menstrual leave, no sanitary provisions, no extra rations for basic needs. The military did not supply pads. Tampons were still considered too controversial, especially for unmarried women. Many female soldiers or workers relied on reusable cloth pads, folded, pinned, washed in barrack sinks when no one was looking. In field reports and oral histories, menstruation is almost entirely absent, not because it didn't happen, but because it was culturally erased. You could talk about dysentery, you could talk about trench foot, but menstrual cramps, discharge, flow, that remained unspoken. Yet the need was so pervasive that women devised systems of mutual support. In British munitions factories, where women worked long shifts under toxic exposure, they passed rags to one another, shared washcloths, and kept notes on when they might need to cover for someone stepping out with pain. In Soviet trenches, women shared spare pieces of wool or soft fabric for padding, often cutting strips from uniforms already falling apart. Sometimes they used newspapers, rolled tightly, stuffed into undergarments, absorbent enough to survive a patrol, though not without consequence. The risk of infection was constant. In Nazi concentration camps, menstruation all but disappeared. Malnutrition, stress, and extreme trauma caused amenorrhea in many imprisoned women, but for those who still bled, the experience was dehumanizing. There were no supplies, no cloth, no soap. Women used scraps of whatever they could find, if they could find anything at all. Blood-soaked garments were worn for days, sometimes weeks. Women were punished for staining beds or benches. Some tied string around their thighs to try to block the flow. Others resorted to stuffing rags between their legs, stolen and hidden from camp laundry. The pain was constant. The shame was weaponized. In Japanese internment camps, both in Asia and abroad, women faced similar indignities. Supplies were rationed to absurd limits. A box of pads might be shared among a dozen women. Privacy was non-existent. And yet, even here, women created underground systems bartering for cloth, saving bits of soap, forming quiet networks of support. In Vietnam, female soldiers of the Viet Cong faced a different challenge: jungle warfare. Humid, unsanitary conditions made menstruation especially dangerous. Sanitary pads were rare. Women used bark fibers, banana leaves, or improvised cotton strips. Blood attracted insects, increased risk of infection, and made stealth movement more difficult. Yet they carried on, enduring both the physical discomfort and the silence surrounding it. Back in the US, during the same conflict, female nurses and Red Cross workers were sent into combat zones with no formal plan for menstrual care. Their medical kits were stocked with morphine, scalpels, antiseptic, but nothing for themselves. They learned to carry their own supplies, to hide tampons in their boots, to ration pads like rations of food. Menstruation was never included in military manuals, not in hygiene guidelines, not in training. It was invisible in planning, logistics, and conversation. Even in the Gulf War of the early 1990s, female soldiers reported being told to take care of it on your own. There were no designated disposal areas, no storage. Some women took birth control continuously to suppress their cycles. Others relied on whatever brands they could find at base commissaries or had supplies mailed from home. Pain relief was similarly lacking. Aches and cramps were treated as secondary concerns, unless they interfered with performance. And if a woman admitted to struggling, she risked being seen as weak, unreliable, or worst of all, distracting. In the years following, slow improvements emerged. Some militaries began including tampons and pads in standard issue. Training programs began to acknowledge the need for menstrual products in emergency kits. Feminine hygiene packs appeared in disaster response units. But the cultural residue lingered. For too long, menstruation was framed as a personal inconvenience, something separate from the mission, as though a soldier's body could simply be partitioned, managed privately in a space where privacy didn't exist. Even today, female soldiers in active service zones report inconsistent access to menstrual products. Tampons are often limited, pad options vary, disposal remains a challenge, and menstrual leave, in most nations, it doesn't exist. The taboo isn't about the blood itself, it's about what the blood represents: vulnerability, humanity. A reminder that even in uniform, women are not machines. They are human bodies, resilient, powerful, but never uncomplicated. And in war there is little tolerance for complication. Yet within the silence, women adapted, improvised, supported each other in ways both practical and emotional. A whispered heads up, a spare cloth tucked into a sleeve, a moment of cover while someone stepped behind a wall to change. These were acts of care, these were acts of resistance, and they happened alongside the more visible forms of bravery: bandaging wounds, navigating minefields, pulling bodies from rubble. To bleed in war is to carry a secret the battlefield doesn't know how to hold. To manage discomfort while loading a rifle, to fold a strip of fabric when the sky is falling. It is not just endurance, it is survival. And though history books won't list it among medals or campaigns, the women who managed their cycles in bunkers, camps and conflict zones carried more than gear. They carried shame that wasn't theirs. They carried silence like weight. And still they stood. You've seen the commercials. Women dancing in white, spinning in fields, diving into pools, always smiling, always carefree. Somewhere blue liquid spills gracefully onto a pad, as if it were a perfume ad. The screen fades to soft pinks and blues, a whisper of a promise. Freedom, confidence, discretion. But behind the gloss of advertising lies a quiet, curated shame, a carefully constructed narrative that has shaped how menstruation is seen, not just by society but by the people experiencing it. Menstrual advertising began in the 1920s with Kotex, which was among the first to publicly market disposable pads. But it wasn't bold, it was evasive. Ads instructed women to ask for the product by name, suggesting that even the word Kotex was too risky to say aloud. The product was kept behind pharmacy counters. It was handed over in plain wrapping, like contraband. From the beginning, menstrual products were treated not as tools of health, but as secrets. Packaging was discreet, branding was vague. Early ads used terms like sanitary napkin or feminine hygiene without ever clarifying what was actually being sold. The implication was clear. This was not a topic for polite conversation. By the 1930s and 40s, the euphemisms grew. Freshness, protection, delicate days. Women were told that menstrual products weren't just for comfort, they were for preserving dignity. Ads warned against offensive odors and unpleasant accidents, reinforcing the idea that menstruation was something to hide, control, and mask at all costs. This language created a script. It told women that their natural cycles were inconvenient at best, disgusting at worst. If they didn't manage it perfectly, if they leaked, if they smelled, if they were seen carrying a pad, they had failed some unspoken test. In the 1950s, the marketing became even more polished. Television entered the picture, but menstruation remained invisible. You could advertise soap, toothpaste, even laxatives on TV. But menstrual products? Too taboo. Instead, print media took over. Magazines targeted at women filled their pages with modest ads. Illustrations of young women holding purses or gazing into mirrors. The products were described as modern, improved, barely noticeable. The fear was always the same: someone might know. Companies leaned into this anxiety. Packaging promised silent wrappers and discreet disposal. Pads were advertised not for their function, but for how well they could be hidden. Some brands designed belt systems so subtle they wouldn't show beneath clothing. Others emphasized their products' whiteness, as if purity could somehow be sold in absorbent layers. Tampons entered the scene in the 1930s, but were kept on the margins of advertising. Tampax, the first major tampon brand, focused its early marketing on nurses and athletes, women whose work required mobility and discretion. The average housewife, meanwhile, was encouraged to stick with pads. Tampons were too modern, too internal, too controversial. Ads for tampons often included reassurances: safe for virgins, tested by doctors, approved by mothers. The language was clinical, almost apologetic. In some communities, tampons were seen as morally questionable, so brands tiptoed, careful not to offend, careful not to explain too much. The result was a generation of women who learned about their own bodies through the lens of absence. Absence of information, absence of visibility, absence of voice. In the 1960s and 70s, second-wave feminism began to challenge this silence. Activists pointed out how absurd it was that menstrual products were essential but treated as shameful. Underground publications began printing real discussions of menstruation. Pamphlets mocked the coy language of ads. Some campaigns called for open education in schools, for honest depictions of menstrual realities. Still, the industry resisted. Television continued to ban direct references to menstruation until the 1980s. Even when commercials were allowed, they weren't explicit. The famous blue liquid, meant to demonstrate absorbency, became a symbol of everything that was missing from the conversation. Blood, even fake blood, was too controversial. Ads promised women they could do anything during their periods: run marathons, climb mountains, wear white jeans. But they never acknowledged cramps, fatigue, or the emotional toll of monthly bleeding. The message wasn't empowerment, it was performance. You could do anything, as long as no one knew you were bleeding. And so shame continued to sell. In the 1980s and 90s, marketing strategies shifted slightly. Brands like Always Stay Free, and Playtex entered competitive battles. The innovation wars began. Thinner pads, wings, scented options, super absorbent tampons. Commercials still used coded language, but now they leaned into competition. Locks in moisture better, protects all day, whisper thin. The focus was still on invisibility. Meanwhile, menstrual education remained inconsistent. Some schools offered basic sex ed, others avoided menstruation altogether. In many countries, young people learned more from commercials than from classrooms, and the commercials weren't teaching, they were branding. A pad wasn't just a pad, it was a lifestyle choice. A declaration of how well you could conform to society's expectations of silence and cleanliness. In the 2000s, a subtle rebellion began. Independent brands like Lunar Pads, Thinks, and Diva Cup challenged the mainstream. They used words like period and blood without apology. They showed real bodies. They highlighted sustainability, cost, and comfort instead of shame. These brands didn't just sell products. They sold a philosophy. Menstruation is normal. It doesn't need to be hidden, and managing it shouldn't feel like a covert operation. Mainstream brands took notice. Ads became more direct. The word period began to appear on screens. Campaigns like a Girl by Always tackled period stigma head-on, showing how deeply cultural perceptions affect self-esteem. But the transition was uneven. In some regions, especially in conservative countries, menstrual ads were still banned from television. Even where allowed, local customs often dictated content. In many Asian, Middle Eastern and African nations, ads stuck to the old playbook. Euphemisms, light blue visuals, soft piano music. And then came the internet. Social media gave individuals, especially young women, a platform to bypass traditional advertising altogether. Hashtags like period positive, normalize periods, and end period poverty brought menstruation into public discourse. Influencers began reviewing products openly. Some posted photos of stained sheets, bloody underwear, menstrual cups. For the first time, the narrative wasn't controlled by corporations, it was crowdsourced. Brands began to follow. Products like organic pads, reusable underwear, and non-applicator tampons were suddenly everywhere. Companies leaned into authenticity, showing racially diverse bodies, non-binary models, even animated blood in red instead of blue. Still, many of these campaigns walked a fine line. How much honesty is too much? Can menstruation be marketed without being sterilized? The truth is, advertising has never just reflected reality, it shapes it, and menstrual product advertising has long shaped what people think is acceptable to say, show, and feel. For generations, shame was profitable. It kept people silent. It made them loyal to brands that promised secrecy. It made them pay extra for scented, ultra-thin, double-wrapped products that wouldn't make a sound in their bag. Even today, shame lingers in the language we use, in the hesitation before we ask for a pad in public, in the aisle labelled feminine care, as though care must be cloaked in gender and politeness. But the whispers are growing louder. New brands, new voices, and new generations are refusing to be quiet. They are laughing at old ads, demanding transparency, and designing their own campaigns, ones that speak to pain, reality, and pride. Menstrual advertising is not just about selling products anymore, it's about reclaiming the conversation. Because in the end, the most revolutionary ad might not be the one that sells you a pad, it might be the one that tells the truth. Without shame, without apology, just honesty, at last, in full colour. In a quiet classroom, somewhere between math equations and grammar drills, a student shifts uncomfortably in her seat. She feels the first tug of a cramp. She's not sure if she packed a pad. She's even less sure she can ask. Around her, the lesson continues. Chalk against board, pages turning. No room for bodies to speak up. This is how the stigma begins, not with cruelty, but with silence. For decades, schools have been where young people first encounter structured knowledge about their bodies. But for menstruation, that education has often been delayed, fragmented, or laced with embarrassment. Many students report learning about periods only through hushed conversations, outdated pamphlets, or gender-segregated health classes, where girls are hurriedly handed a pad and boys are sent to gym. In some schools, menstruation is barely covered at all. In others, it's discussed clinically, stripped of emotion, nuance, or cultural relevance. There are still teachers who skip the chapter, still parents who ask for their children to be excused, still counsellors who suggest it's not appropriate for certain grades. The result is a generation taught that menstruation is something to manage quietly, to hide, and so girls learn to tuck pads into sleeves, to ask for supplies in coded language, to sit out of gym with vague excuses. If they stain their clothes, they tie jackets around their waists. If they bleed through a chair, they scrub it themselves. The shame becomes muscle memory. In poorer schools, the problem deepens. Menstrual products are expensive. Not every student has access. Some reuse pads for days. Others use toilet paper folded in layers. Still others stay home entirely during their period, not because of pain, but because they have nothing to wear. A missed day here, two there. It adds up. Over time, girls fall behind, not because they're less capable, but because they're bleeding in a world that refuses to accommodate. The irony is, schools are full of signs of bodily needs: bathroom passes, snack breaks, water bottles. But for menstruation, the signals vanish. No free pads, no designated disposal bins, no clear policy. Just a stall, a trash can, and hope. In some countries, this absence is fatal to education. Studies across South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Latin America show that lack of menstrual supplies is a leading cause of dropout among girls. When a girl has no safe place to change, no products to use, and no adults willing to talk about it, school becomes a battleground. But the stigma doesn't end with adolescence. In workplaces, menstruation becomes even more invisible. You're expected to show up, focus, dress professionally, smile, meet deadlines, all while managing cramps, migraines, bloating, fatigue, or the ever-present fear of bleeding through your clothes. There are no paid menstrual leaves in most countries, no sick days for period pain. In fact, most office cultures discourage any mention of menstruation. Bring it up and you're dismissed as unprofessional, or dramatic, or weak. This silence hurts in small ways. When someone asks why you're pale or quiet, you deflect. When you run to the restroom for the 4th time in a morning, you pray no one notices. When a colleague jokes about that time of the month, you laugh, but the joke isn't funny. And the silence hurts in big ways too. Women with endometriosis, fibroids, or PCOS often suffer through debilitating symptoms with no workplace support. Some pass out from pain, others bleed heavily for weeks. Still, they go to meetings. Still, they smile. They fear being labelled as unreliable, so they say nothing. In high-pressure fields, finance, law, tech, the pressure to tough it out is even worse. The ideal worker is tireless, unaffected by biology. Menstruation doesn't fit the mold. It's seen as a distraction, a flaw, something best left at home, and so the burden falls on individuals to cope, to conceal. Even the logistics of menstruating at work can be humiliating. In some offices, restrooms have no disposal bins. In others, women carry supplies to the bathroom in clutched fists or hidden bags. Leaving a pad on a desk by accident can feel like a social disaster. Asking a male colleague for a tampon feels unthinkable. It is easier to bleed quietly. Public spaces are no better. Menstrual products are still taxed as luxury goods in many regions. Pads and tampons are locked in cabinets, sold behind counters or priced beyond reach. In bathrooms, dispensers are often empty, broken or non-existent. Airports sell travel pillows and face masks in vending machines, but rarely tampons. Concert venues charge for bottled water, but offer nothing for period pain. Public transport rarely accommodates the reality of bleeding. Long commutes, limited restrooms, no privacy. Women learn to calculate routes based on restroom access, to pack emergency kits, to plan their day not by meetings or meals, but by flow. And if an accident happens, if blood stains a seat or leaks onto pants, the public response is rarely kind. Whispers, stares, laughter. Menstruation is still treated as a breach of decorum. You can cough in public, sneeze, blow your nose, but a pad peeking out of your bag, a leak on your pants, that becomes a spectacle. For homeless individuals, the stakes are even higher. Access to menstrual products is inconsistent at best. Shelters often lack supplies. Public bathrooms are limited. The choice becomes brutal: food or pads, warmth or hygiene. Staining becomes inevitable, and with it, judgment. Some wrap themselves in layers of clothing. Some use newspaper. Some bleed onto park benches, not by choice, but by design. The system wasn't built for them, and yet change is happening. Slowly, unevenly, but undeniably. Some schools now provide free products in restrooms. Some workplaces acknowledge period pain as legitimate. Some cities have begun to treat pads and tampons as essential, like soap or toilet paper. Grassroots movements, often led by students, teachers, and activists, have pushed for policy changes: free vend dispensers, inclusive education, workplace accommodations. Menstrual leave has been introduced in countries like Japan, South Korea, and Indonesia, though often met with backlash. Critics argue it reinforces stereotypes, but for those in pain, it's not a privilege. It's a necessity. Some companies are listening. Tech startups and progressive firms have begun offering period days or flexible work-from-home options. They stock restrooms with supplies. They create spaces for conversation. But stigma is stubborn. Even when the policy exists, the culture doesn't always follow. Workers hesitate to take leave. Students hesitate to ask for supplies. The fear of being seen as less capable lingers, and so visibility becomes the first step. Posters in bathrooms, honest education, colleagues who offer a pad without flinching, teachers who don't shame students for asking to go to the restroom twice. Small acts but transformative ones. Because stigma isn't just in policy, it's in posture, in how we speak, in how we respond. A girl shouldn't have to apologize for bleeding. A worker shouldn't have to hide in shame. A person in pain shouldn't be asked to smile through it. Menstruation is not the problem. The silence around it is, and that silence begins in aisles, in classrooms, in office break rooms. But it doesn't have to end there. It can end with a question asked without shame, a product passed without secrecy, a moment of discomfort met not with judgment, but understanding. It can end when we stop pretending the most common thing in the world is too impolite to name. In many places, bleeding means absence. Not absence of importance or capacity, but absence from school, work, life. A week missed every month, silently, repeatedly, until the rhythm of education is broken. This is what period poverty looks like. It doesn't always wear the face of crisis. Sometimes it wears the face of resignation. A girl staying home in rural Nepal because she has no pad. A student in a Kenyan village using a piece of mattress foam. A teenager in a US city rationing a single tampon across 2 days because her family couldn't afford more. Period poverty is not just the lack of products. It's the lack of access, infrastructure, information, dignity. It's a systemic failure wrapped in silence. Around the world, millions of students are affected. In low-income countries, the statistics are blunt. According to UNICEF and UNESCO reports, 1 in 10 African girls misses school during menstruation. In Uganda, the figure can rise as high as 1 in 4. In India, nearly 23% of girls drop out of school entirely after reaching puberty. The reasons are painfully consistent. No money for sanitary pads. No toilets with privacy. No disposal bins. No pain medication. No understanding. Instead, there's shame, isolation, and silence. In Ethiopia, girls report using old rags, leaves, or even ash to manage their periods. In Afghanistan, pieces of old carpet are sometimes cut and repurposed. In Bangladesh, menstrual cloths are often dried in dark corners of the home to avoid the evil eye. But this lack of sunlight leads to bacterial infections. In refugee camps, women fashion makeshift pads from tent fabric, plastic bags, or whatever they can scavenge. What links these realities is not geography, it's inequality. Even within the same country, rural girls suffer more than urban, low-income girls suffer more than affluent. Marginalized groups, indigenous, disabled, LGBTQ+, face higher risks of missing education due to compounded stigma. And menstruation becomes not just a biological experience, but a social barrier. In some regions, menstruating girls are seen as impure or cursed. Taboos restrict them from entering kitchens, temples, or public spaces. In parts of western Nepal, girls are forced to sleep outside in menstrual huts, chowpadi, despite the practice being outlawed. These huts are often cold, unventilated, dangerous. Some girls have died of snake bites, smoke inhalation, or exposure while isolated. And if they're too afraid or ashamed to go to school, their education ends not with graduation, but with silence. The shame is institutional too. In many schools, there are no separate toilets for girls. If toilets exist, they're often broken, lack doors, or don't have running water. Without privacy, changing a pad becomes a nightmare. Disposal is worse. Students hide used cloths in bags, bury them outside, or throw them in open fields. Imagine managing your period under those conditions, and then being expected to focus on geometry. Even where pads are technically available, they may be priced beyond reach. In Kenya, a pack of sanitary pads can cost the equivalent of a full day's wages. In rural India, they're simply not stocked. In parts of Latin America, girls have reported skipping school during menstruation because they only have one uniform, and if it stains, they must stay home. Period poverty isn't just about economics. It's about who is considered worth planning for. Boys get textbooks, sports equipment, scholarships. Girls? Girls get lectures about modesty, warnings about womanhood, and the quiet expectation that they'll figure it out themselves. But they shouldn't have to. Some programs have begun to push back. In 2010, Kenya became one of the first countries to eliminate taxes on menstrual products and implement a national program to distribute free pads to schoolgirls. India followed with initiatives like the Free Days Pad campaign, aiming to normalise access through public health centres. In Scotland, a 2020 bill made menstrual products free for all, marking a global milestone. But even with these policies, gaps remain. Distribution is inconsistent. Teachers are not always trained. Cultural resistance still blocks implementation in conservative communities. Where government support is thin, NGOs and grassroots movements step in. Organisations like Days for Girls, the Pad Project, and AfriPads manufacture low-cost, reusable products and distribute them along with education on menstrual health. Local activists run workshops, build community toilets, and advocate for inclusive curriculum changes. But progress is fragile. In war zones and disaster areas, menstrual health is often ignored in emergency aid. Relief packages include food, water, shelter, but rarely pads or painkillers. In refugee camps across the Middle East, displaced girls and women often rely on a single pack of disposable pads for an entire month, shared among family members. In places where menstruation is viewed as shameful, girls may not even know what's happening to them. A 2014 study in India found that nearly 70% of girls had no knowledge about menstruation before their first period. The result? Fear, panic, trauma. Without education, even access can become meaningless. A girl who doesn't understand how to use a pad, or who is told that touching one will make her infertile, is unlikely to use it. She may revert to unsafe methods, or avoid school altogether. Education must come with context. It must name the body clearly. It must normalize care. It must dismantle shame. And this isn't just a developing world problem. In the United States, 1 in 5 girls has reported missing school because they couldn't afford menstrual products. In the UK, the issue affects roughly 10% of teenage girls. In Australia, Remote indigenous communities suffer from supply shortages and high product costs. Period poverty is global. It just looks different in different zip codes. In wealthier nations, the stigma often hides behind packaging and politeness. Students hesitate to ask teachers for a pad. School nurses are understocked. Bathrooms lack bins. Some students wear 2 pairs of underwear or layer toilet paper to get through the day. They bleed in silence, then apologize for it. But the problem is systemic, not individual. Until products are treated like toilet paper, essential, free, and expected, students will keep falling behind. Until curriculum includes menstrual health as core biology, not shameful afterthought, stigma will linger, and until communities confront the cultural taboos that turn girls into exiles during menstruation, the barriers will stand. Solutions require more than pads. They require bathrooms, teachers, policies, courage. They require acknowledging that education is not just about books, it's about bodies. And every body deserves support, dignity, and the chance to stay in the classroom, not be pushed out by biology. Period poverty may start with a lack of products, but it ends with enough silence, with a lack of opportunity, and no child should have to choose between managing their body and building their future. Some revolutions don't arrive with banners or broken chains. They arrive in hashtags, in courtrooms, in school bathrooms stocked with free pads. They arrive in quiet defiance, the first time someone says period in a parliament, the first time a red stain is not hidden, the first time menstruation is treated not as a private burden but a public right. This is the shape of modern menstrual activism, not a single march, but a global shift in how bleeding is seen, talked about, and accommodated. It begins, as many movements do, with listening. Activists around the world started collecting stories. Schoolgirls in Nairobi, nurses in Delhi, inmates in Los Angeles, refugees in Lebanon. Their stories weren't about ideology or theory. They were about dignity, about what it felt like to bleed without a pad, to beg for tampons, to be shamed into silence by systems that were designed without them in mind. These stories sparked a movement. In the early 2000s, a wave of non-profit organizations began reframing menstruation, not as a women's issue, but a justice issue. The PAD Project, Days for Girls, Menstrual Health Hub, and countless grassroots campaigns began advocating for 3 core rights: access to products, accurate information, and the removal of stigma. They called it menstrual equity. Equity, not because everyone bleeds, but because everyone who does should have what they need to do so safely and without shame. The movement took on the tampon tax, the long-standing classification of menstrual products as luxury goods in many countries. Activists asked the obvious question: how could something so essential be taxed like perfume? The campaigns went viral. Protesters showed up at parliaments in blood-red pants. They mailed pads to legislators. They flooded social media with photos, stories, and demands. Hashtags like End Period Poverty and Tampon Tax trended across continents, and it worked. Kenya scrapped its tampon tax in 2004. Canada followed in 2015. India, Australia, Colombia, and parts of the United States passed similar legislation. Scotland went further than any country in 2020 by becoming the first to make menstrual products free to all citizens, enshrined in law. It was a landmark, but it wasn't the end. Activists weren't just fighting taxes, they were fighting erasure. In many communities, menstruation was still taboo, still filtered through superstition or silence, so they started talking louder. They made documentaries, held workshops, printed comics explaining periods in local languages. In Zambia, women trained teachers to speak about menstruation without shame. In the UK, teenagers launched school clubs to stock restrooms with products. In Japan, graphic designers created sleek, user-friendly menstrual product maps for public spaces. In India, a Bollywood film, Padman, turned a real-life innovator's story into a national conversation. Arunachalam Murugananthan, a school dropout who invented a low-cost pad-making machine, became a symbol of ingenuity and defiance. His machines were installed in hundreds of villages, giving women not just hygiene but livelihoods. Activism also entered the courtroom. In 2019, a class action lawsuit was filed in the United States against major prison systems for denying incarcerated women access to menstrual products. The stories were harrowing. Women forced to bleed through their clothes, beg guards for pads, or barter with other inmates for basic supplies. The legal fight reframed the issue. This wasn't about comfort, it was about constitutional rights. By 2020, the federal prison system in the US mandated access to free menstrual products in all facilities. Some state systems followed, others still lag behind. Meanwhile, digital spaces became fertile ground for breaking taboos. Influencers began posting photos of stained underwear. Athletes like Kiran Gandhi ran marathons while freely bleeding to spark dialogue. Brands were challenged for using blue liquid in commercials instead of red. Some responded, others resisted. New companies, Thinx, Modibody, Diva Cup, embraced the conversation. They marketed with transparency. They used inclusive language. They hired trans and non-binary models. They didn't just sell products, they sold participation in a cultural shift, and yet resistance remains. Menstrual justice faces pushback, not just from institutions, but from discomfort. School boards hesitate to expand education. Workplaces balk at providing leave. Politicians mock or minimize policy changes. Even within feminist movements, menstrual health is sometimes sidelined, but the red wave doesn't retreat. It grows broader. It now includes people of all genders. It includes climate activists, pointing out the environmental cost of disposable products. It includes disability advocates, highlighting the lack of accessibility in mainstream designs. It includes artists, engineers, parents, midwives, scientists. The fight is no longer just about shame, it's about structure. How we design our bathrooms, how we stock our schools, how we build disaster relief kits, how we write our budgets, how we teach children to name their bodies with respect instead of fear. Some governments are catching on. In New Zealand, period products are now provided free in all schools. In France, university students receive subsidized pads and tampons. In Seoul, city libraries and subway stations stock menstrual kits in vending machines. In Botswana, Parliament passed a bill mandating free sanitary pads for all public schools. And still, in many countries, silence reigns. In war zones, no one brings menstrual kits. In refugee camps, supplies run out by the 10th of the month. In conservative cultures, girls are still pulled out of school, still told not to touch food, still taught that bleeding makes them less. This is where the next chapter of activism lives, not in grand gestures, but in door-to-door campaigns. In men joining the conversation, in laws that include menstruation in public health budgets, in businesses that treat period leave like sick leave, not as a favour, but a right. Justice doesn't arrive all at once. It arrives in vending machines that finally dispense pads, in textbooks that teach without shame, in a workplace drawer where someone quietly stocks supplies for others, in a tweet that says, "I bleed and I'm not sorry." Menstrual justice is not a niche issue. It's a mirror for how we value people who bleed. It asks whether dignity is conditional, whether health depends on silence, whether justice can flow downstream only when it's convenient. And it reminds us that no movement is too small when it makes someone feel seen. This is not the end of the red wave, it's the beginning of its next crest. There is a quiet rebellion happening, not in the streets but in the mirror, in the choice to stand tall while holding a pad, in the decision to post, to speak, to no longer whisper about cycles and stains and cramps. It's not a shout, but a reclamation. Menstruation is no longer being hidden, it's being honoured. For centuries the bleeding body was something to obscure, to manage, to survive. But slowly, around the world, the language of shame is being replaced by the language of celebration. The cycle, once cloaked in euphemism, is finding its own vocabulary again. It's visible in art galleries that display sculptures made from stained cloth and red-dyed thread, not as shock, but as homage. It's in schools that host menstrual education days, inviting both boys and girls to learn together, ask questions, and listen without ridicule. It's in the rise of cycle-positive apps, books, podcasts, tools that teach not just the science of menstruation, but the power of tracking, knowing, and honoring the rhythms of the body. But reclaiming pride doesn't mean pretending pain doesn't exist. It means making space for it. It means believing someone when they say their cramps are debilitating, that their cycle affects their cognition, their energy, their mood, that the hormonal ebb and flow is not a weakness, but a reality. The new cycle isn't just about celebration, it's about honesty. And in that honesty, healing begins. Modern science has begun listening too. What was once dismissed as women's trouble is now a field of serious inquiry. Researchers study the neurological impacts of hormonal phases, the cellular patterns of uterine shedding, the long-term effects of synthetic birth control on cycles. Period tracking apps are contributing to large-scale health studies, helping decode how menstruation affects sleep, metabolism, even immune function. It's slow, but it's a start. More importantly, the new cycle is inclusive. It understands that not all women menstruate, and not all who menstruate are women. Trans men and non-binary people who bleed have entered the conversation, not with demands for special treatment, but with a simple ask, be seen. Some brands have dropped gendered packaging. Some healthcare providers are learning to use more inclusive language. Menstrual justice, in its truest form, is expanding its arms, not shrinking them. The next wave of education reflects this. Teachers are being trained to teach without shame. Health classes are beginning to acknowledge period poverty, cultural variation, and body literacy. More schools are providing products, not as charity, but as infrastructure. No different from soap or water. The message is not just you can still go to school while bleeding. The message is, your body belongs here, exactly as it is. Reclaiming menstruation also means unlearning. Unlearning the reflex to apologize, to hide products up your sleeve, to whisper, to fear a leak, to believe that a stain makes you less. Unlearning doesn't happen overnight. But with every campaign that says periods are normal, with every product ad that shows red instead of blue, with every person who speaks up instead of sitting out, the old conditioning erodes, and in its place, something gentler grows. The rise of rituals, modern ones, period kits gifted at menarche, conversations between mothers and sons, ceremonies led by doulas or midwives, not to sanctify the blood, but to acknowledge it without fear. People are beginning to talk about cyclical living, the idea that we should listen to the body's natural phases, rather than override them. That productivity can have seasons, that rest isn't laziness, that there's wisdom in slowness. Some communities have embraced the idea fully. Yoga teachers schedule flows around ovulation and menstruation. Workplaces experiment with flexible schedules. Artists plan their exhibitions around their energy peaks. None of it is militant, it's simply mindful. In parts of Africa and Latin America, local artisans now craft reusable cloth pads, dyed with natural pigments, stitched with patterns passed down through generations. The act of making, wearing and sharing these products is not just practical, it's cultural revival. In Nordic countries, government-backed menstrual policies are framed through the lens of bodily dignity. In the US, period equity has entered the presidential conversation. In India, campaigns led by students have rebranded menstruation as Masit Dharma, a phrase that translates not to impurity, but duty. The words matter. They are the vessel through which pride returns. It's visible in art, in the paintings of menstruating bodies without shame, in theatre performances where blood is not metaphoric, but literal, in zines, comics, and street murals. It's visible in commerce, in the small business that prints shirts saying "Power in my period", in subscription boxes curated for comfort, in sustainable brands that treat bleeding as beautiful, not bothersome. It's even showing up in politics. Menstrual equity bills are being introduced in parliaments. Protesters hold up stained flags not as symbols of disgust but endurance. Some nations now measure menstrual health as a human rights indicator, because to bleed safely, freely, and without shame should never be revolutionary. It should be normal. It's a sign of functioning democracy, of dignity, of healthcare that sees the full picture. Reclaiming menstruation with pride is also about looking forward, not just to the next period, but to the generation that's coming, to the child who hears the word menstruation before hearing it as a punchline, to the student who finds a stocked dispenser in every bathroom, to the refugee who receives pads alongside food and shelter, to the employee who takes period leave without guilt, to the artist whose work doesn't censor the red, to the world where no one ever says, "I'm sorry I'm on my period," but instead says nothing at all, because it no longer requires justification, because it's ordinary. It's part of the body, part of time, part of what it means to grow, to shed, to renew. That's what the new cycle promises. Not perfection, not constant celebration, but honesty, visibility, access. Menstruation as a mirror, not a mask. Something to understand, not erase. And for the first time in history, it feels possible. Not because shame has vanished, but because so many are choosing to bleed out loud. I am a man, and I'll never truly understand what it feels like to bleed, to hide it, to be shamed for it, to still show up anyway. But tonight, after everything we've explored, I feel something deeper than understanding. I feel respect, because behind every chapter in this story is someone who endured quietly. A schoolgirl who stayed home, a midwife who worked through cramps, a mother who never spoke about it, but always made sure her daughter had what she didn't. This isn't just a history of menstruation, it's a history of resilience, of surviving systems not built for you, of adapting, again and again, without being asked how it feels. And as a man watching this, maybe the most powerful thing I can do is listen.